Welcome back to Hammer. Tonight we got an insane battle between one of the oldest rivalries in Warhammer, that being the Imperial Fist and Iron Warriors. We got Dorn fresh off the heresy, extremely pissed at the results. And we got Perturabo also fresh off the heresy, mad because nobody listens to him like always. Maybe the heresy would have gone differently had they listened. This is a recipe for madness. And before we get into the video, be sure to like, comment any videos, topics, ideas you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. As always, let's get into the madness.
The palace still bled. Marble that had once been perfect, vat-grown stone from 100 conquered worlds, lay split into jagged strata. Golden aquila hung broken-winged from ceilings cracked by bombardment. Dust and ash lay in drifts knee-deep in places. Grey snow that had once been men, custodians, legionaries, mortal soldiers, all ground down to anonymous powder under the treads of war. Rogel Dorn walked through it like a warden pacing the corridors of a prison he had failed to guard. His footfalls were heavy, armored boots crunching bone fragments until they became one with the dust. The sound echoed strangely in the wounded halls. Once, there had been the thunder of processions, the roar of triumphal banners, the layered chant of 1,000,000 voices praising the master of mankind. Now there was only the faint, hollow ring of ceramite on stone, and the whisper of air through ruptured bulkheads. The screams lingered here. They were not carried by vox or air, they were impressions, burned into his mind, the psychic echo of 10,000 last moments. He could see every breach point with the clarity of a tactical display, every wall that had failed, every chamber where the enemy had stood when they should never have reached that far. Every place his defenses had not been sufficient. Failure, not in principle, not in doctrine, but in fact. Terror still stood, and Horus lay dead, and yet in his mind, that word carved the inside of his skull. He turned a corner into a hall that should have been pristine, and found a squad of his sons waiting there. They rose as one, imperial fists in plate still scored by siege scars, yellow armor blackened and cracked, heraldry obscured by burned blood and flaking ash, bare-headed, helms held under arms, faces carved by duty rather than age. They bowed, fists to breastplate. "Lord Primarch," said the nearest, a captain whose name he knew, whose genealogy and commendations he could recite in an instant if asked, though right now he did not care. "The palace stands because of you. The Imperium lives. This is victory." The word struck him like a slap. "Victory," Dorn repeated. His voice came out low, rough with disuse and restraint. "You speak that word in this graveyard." The captain swallowed, but did not look away. That was good. Dorn had no patience for sons who could not bear the sight of their father. "The traitor lies dead," the captain went on. "The arch-heretic has fallen. The banner of the Imperium still flies from the highest spires. The enemy fleets are in flight. If this is not victory, then what is?" Dorn stepped closer until he towered over the captain. Behind the officer, the rest of the squad held themselves rigid, disciplined, eyes fixed forward. "Look," Dorn said. He took the captain by the shoulder, fingers closing hard enough to crush adamantine. He turned the man bodily, forcing his gaze down the hall to where a breach in the wall opened out across a shattered concourse and into the ruins beyond. Far away, the broken silhouette of a hive spire jutted up through smog and smoke like a snapped bone. "Look," he said again. "Do you see what I see? I see every man who died where he should not have needed to. I see every line that should not have broken. I see the walls of the palace breached. I see my failure. Do not bring me that word while this still stands around us." There was a flicker of pain in the captain's eyes. It was not for himself. "We held," the officer said quietly. "You held. We did not break, my lord." Dorn's hand tightened. For a heartbeat, his sons thought he would strike the captain across the hall with that iron grip, dash him into the wall as easily as he had dashed traitor skulls. Instead, the Primarch let go, the motion abrupt, as if even that contact burned. "Prepare the strategium," Dorn said. "Summon the senior brethren. If this is victory, then we shall see what it was purchased with." He walked away, without another word, the sound of his tread becoming the only noise once more, swallowing their murmured responses. Behind him, the Imperial fists watched their father depart and did not speak of triumph again. In the heart of what had once been the most secure fortress in human history, the War Council convened under sagging banners. The strategium of the Imperial Palace had been rebuilt hastily after the final bombardments. Scorched cogitators and shattered hololithic projectors had been dragged out, replaced with functioning banks that hummed and clicked. The great marble table at the center, once a single flawless slab, was now a patchwork of different stones taken from different wings of the palace, a mosaic of fracture lines and repairs. Around it stood the captains and high officers of the 7th Legion, Sigismund, his black and yellow plate still carrying the stains of demon blood, Alexis Pollux, scarred and broad, the memory of Thrall written into every line of his face, dozens more, each the scion of 1,000 campaigns. Behind them, mortal scribes and remembrancers, what few remained, ready to record and calculate, quills hovering over fresh vellum. Dawn came last. The murmurs in the chamber died as his massive form filled the archway. He said nothing at first. He walked to the table's edge, gauntleted hands resting on the cracked marble as he surveyed the projection that hovered above it. Segmentum maps, light years of ruin, the scars of the heresy writ large, worlds marked as lost, others as contested, a meager scattering as secure. And there, like a malign node, the symbol of the Iron Warriors hung over the name Sebastus IV. "Reports," Dorn said. A Vox adept cleared his throat, voice thin in the vast chamber. "Trait, Iron Warrior forces, my lord. The enemy Primarch Perturabo has withdrawn significant elements of his legion to Sebastus IV, an industrial world in the Perturabo Channel. Orbital Picts, where the storms permit, show massive fortification works underway. Forges, bunkers, trench works, a complex of fortresses on a continental scale. Eternal Fortress," Sigismund muttered. "That is the name they use." "Eternal," Pollux echoed with quiet disdain. "Nothing that bleeds and rusts is eternal." The adept nodded nervously. "The complex appears to be arranged in the pattern of an 8-pointed star," he added, voice quavering as he said it, as if the very mention of that blasphemous geometry were an invocation. Dawn stared at the hololithic image. Grainy augur ghosts showed grids of trenches, miles of ferrocrete walls, bastion towers like fanged teeth, minefields and tank traps, and buried silos. The whole structure radiated outward in jagged symmetry. Everything about it spoke of Perturabo. "It is a challenge," said one of the senior captains, a veteran of the Ring of Iron around Terra. "He taunts us, Lord. He dares us to come for him." "He dares me," Dorn said. "Not us, me." A murmur of anger passed through the chamber. The feud between the master of the Imperial Fists and the Lord of the Iron Warriors was old, and every man here knew its history. They had fought side by side in the Great Crusade. They had built and torn down fortresses together. They had tested each other's works. Pride and rivalry had become bitterness long before Perturabo had turned his guns upon the walls of the Imperium. Now, in the smouldering wake of terror, that rivalry had become an open wound. A captain cleared his throat. He wore campaign markings from the great scouring already underway beyond Sol, where the loyal legions were driving the traitors back world by world. "Lord Primarch," he began carefully, "our brothers bleed across the stars. The heresy broke the legions as surely as it broke this palace. Our numbers are depleted. We must rebuild the 7th. There is talk amongst the Primarchs of reforms, of division, of a codified structure for the legions and their conduct. Dorn's eyes flickered to him. They were no longer the burning coals of battle, but there was nothing gentle in them. "Speak plainly," he said. The captain took a steadying breath. "Robert Gilliman has drawn up the outline of a codex, my lord, a treatise on war and organization. He proposes to divide the legions into smaller chapters, more flexible, harder to turn entire against the Imperium. Many agree that after what has happened, such measures are necessary. The seventh could be broken," Dorn said softly. The captain hesitated, then nodded. "Reformed, Lord, restructured, to ensure that never again could a single force become so dangerous, even in loyalty." Silence hung in the strategium like a blade about to fall. Then Dorn's fist came down. The impact shook the chamber. The patchwork marble table split along old fracture lines, cracks spidering out in a jagged starburst. Beneath his hand, chips of stone became shrapnel, slicing into the faces and arms of nearby scribes. Blood pattered onto the floor, a thin echo of far greater slaughter. "Broken up like chattel," Dorn growled. His voice was iron dragged across stone. "Dismantled because others failed. We held. The seventh held. I will not see my legion carved into pieces because lesser men dream of tidy columns in their ledgers." The captain flinched, but met his Primarch's gaze. "We obey the Emperor's will," he said quietly, "and if his will is expressed through Lord Guilliman's codex, the Emperor is upon the Golden Throne, half dead to save the species that betrayed him," Dorn snapped. "He does not speak. He does not command. We are his hands now, and I will not cut them off, because my brother prefers neat lines to honest stone." He straightened, drawing in a long, slow breath. When he spoke again, his tone was lower, but no softer. "Perturabo has built his fortress. He believes he understands sieges. He believes he can bait me, draw me, bleed me. He believes he has reduced war to a sum he can control. He is wrong. We will go to Sebastus IV. We will tear down his false eternity. We will drag him out of his hole in chains and bring him back here in an iron cage so that all may see what becomes of those who raise their guns against the walls of terror." The words traveled out on Vox, carried to every ship of the 7th Legion, repeated by chaplains and officers, inscribed into augur logs. Astartes aboard battle barges and strike cruisers heard their father's vow. Mortal auxiliar officers standing before endless ranks of human soldiers heard it repeated through crackling amplifiers. Billions of men, from hive scum pressed into regiments to veteran tank commanders with a dozen campaigns behind them, felt that promise settle over them like a sentence. Far away, beyond the glow of the Astronomicon, on the bleak world of Sebastus IV, another Primarch was already preparing the math of their deaths. Deep within the howling forges, Perturabo stood at the edge of an open killing field. The air was thick with dust and propellant smoke. Rows of artillery pieces loomed behind him, colossal macro cannons on tracked mounts, siege mortars in recessed pits, quad-linked auto batteries with cooling shrouds that steamed in the chill air. Iron warriors moved among them with mechanical efficiency, servo limbs clanking, armor the color of old steel, hazard stripes vivid against the drab ferrocrete. Before the guns, a line of human slaves stumbled forward under the watchful muzzles of Legion bolters. They were a random draw from the labor pens. Some were thin men with the stooped shoulders of manufacturing workers, others former soldiers stripped of insignia, all in chains and ragged work clothes. Their eyes stared out in the dull, exhausted way of those who have learned that there is no mercy, only delay. Perturabo raised his hand. The slaves halted. Warsmiths watched from the gun lines, slate skulls hovering at their shoulders, recording every datum. "Range markers," Perturabo said. He lowered his hand. The guns spoke. The world became concussion and flame. Mass reactive shells tore through human bodies, shredding flesh and bone into red vapor and raining fragments. Limbs were pulverized. Torsos opened like rotten fruit. Skulls burst apart in sprays of brains and splintered bone. Some were simply erased, bodies reduced to mist and a scatter of teeth. Those at the fringes of the barrage did not die cleanly. They were hurled into the air, landing in twisted heaps. Some crawled, leaving smeared trails of blood and offal across the pitted ground. "Trace the shell falls," a warsmith intoned. Servo skulls flitted out, Auspex arrays blinking as they mapped the pattern. Calculations appeared on data slates, numbers streaming down. Perturabo watched without expression. The screams did not move him. He saw only arcs, probabilities, the ways in which steel and explosive could be arranged to ensure that when the yellow-armored foe finally marched here, there would be no safe ground for them to stand on. A few of the slaves still lived. A man tried to rise, his lower body a ruined mess of bone jutting through shredded meat. He reached out with both hands, eyes wide with animal terror, and begged wordlessly. Perturabo gestured. "Reinforcement," he said. Iron warriors moved forward, hauling the survivors up by their chains. They dragged them to the edge of the nearest wall, where fresh ferrocrete waited, wet and grey. The men were slammed back against the formwork, arms spread, chains pinned. Construction servitors slotted metal spikes through their wrists and ankles. The slaves screamed again as pouring tubes spewed wet concrete over them, swallowing their bodies slowly in cold, suffocating embrace. "Let them set in place," Perturabo said. "Their fear will make the walls stronger." One of his warsmiths, a veteran with half his face replaced by augmetics, approached, mag boots crunching over bone and brass shell casings. "Lord Perturabo," he said, "the range tables are complete. We can cover this sector, such that nothing larger than a rat will survive crossing it. But I wonder, why such pain, such waste now? The Imperial fists are wounded. They bleed across the stars in the great scouring. Why invite their full strength down upon us?" Perturabo drew a stylus from his belt and reached toward the hololithic projection that hung in the air before them. It showed the Eternal Fortress in miniature. The 8-pointed star spread across the continent, a geometry of hatred etched into land. He traced one of the star's arms with the stylus. "I will teach Dorn the mathematics of despair," he said. "He lives in lines and walls and honor. He understands fortresses, but he has never understood what they do to those who assault them. We will show him. Here, in this arm, 1,000 Astartes will die to gain 100 meters. Here, another 1,000 will bleed to hold it. Every trench is a sum. Every bunker is an equation. I have calculated exactly how many of his sons it will take to fill every ditch with corpses until he reaches the center." The warsmith watched the projection as Perturabo sketched smaller symbols along the lengths of the trenches, annotations in a script that was half mathematics, half hatred. "And when he reaches the center, Lord?" the warsmith asked. "When he stands in the heart of your star?" Perturabo smiled then, a thin, humorless twist of the mouth. "Then I will show him that even when he reaches the answer, it was the wrong question," he said. Across the Imperium, the great scouring raged. The 7th Legion went from world to world like a storm of yellow and black. Iron warrior strongholds were torn down, their bastions toppled, their gene seed taken, and their standards burned. Worlds that had thrown in their lot with the traitors were subjected to sieges of merciless purity. Batteries of Imperial fists guns spoke with the same cold precision with which the Iron Warriors had once shelled loyalist walls. On a death world shrouded in acidic mists, Dawn's sons raised an Iron Warrior citadel, peeling back layer after layer of ferrocrete and steel, until they dragged screaming traitors from the deepest vaults and executed them one by one. On a forge world that had turned cannons on the Emperor's fleets, they toppled the forges themselves, sending foundries the size of cities crashing into magma seas. On a distant Agri moon, They sealed the airlocks on civilian habs that had harbored the enemy and vented them into the void without a word. Each victory was marked in the annals of the 7th Legion. Each victory fed the rage that burned in Rogel Dorn's chest. Every bastion he shattered was not enough. Every fortress that fell under his hammer reminded him of the one fortress he had not been able to prevent the enemy from reaching. The palace on Terra, the only walls that truly mattered. When the first hard picked feeds from Sebastus IV arrived, carried across the warp by astropathic couriers, Dorn stood alone to receive them. The hololithic images were imperfect, smeared by radiation and storm, but they were clear enough. He saw bunkers like black teeth driven into the earth, towers with flak guns bristling like thorns, trenches in labyrinthine lines, cut and recut until the ground resembled some vast, diseased organ, tank traps, minefields, strips of land denuded of all life and matter, flattened into killing grounds. All of it arranged in the pattern of the 8-pointed star, a symbol of the dark powers scored into the skin of a world with concrete and steel. It was an offense on a level deeper than strategy. It was a blasphemy of form, as much as of allegiance. Dorn watched the feeds loop, the flicker of machine spirit static washing over the image. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, jaw clenched. At last he spoke. "Prepare the Legion," he said. When Rogel Dorn addressed his sons before they departed for Sebastus IV, it was not from a polished hall or a gleaming parade ground. It was from the embarkation bays of the Phalanx and the other great void craft that hung in orbit above Terra. The bays were vast cathedrals of steel, echoing with the clank of loading ramps and the roar of engines. Sergeants shouted orders over the din. Servitors trundled back and forth bearing munitions in ponderous lines. Mortal auxiliary regiments stood in ranked formations, a sea of flak armor and laser guns, their faces upturned as they listened to the words coming over the Vox. Dorn's image towered above them on hololithic projectors, cast in pale gold light. In some bays, he stood there in person, his real presence overwhelming, his armor still scarred from the siege, his eyes burning with cold fire. "We go to answer a challenge," he said. His voice was steady, iron hard. "The traitor Perturabo has carved an abomination into the flesh of Sebastus IV. He has built a fortress that he believes cannot fall, a structure of stone and steel and blood to mock the works of the Emperor and the defenses of Terra. He believes that he can draw us in and bleed us out and prove, finally, that his calculations outweigh our faith." He paused, letting the silence gather. "He is wrong." The word hung, heavy and absolute. "I will dig Perturabo out of his hole," Dorn went on. "I will break his walls. I will shatter his guns. I will drag him from the heart of his fortress and bring him back here in chains of iron to hang before the palace he once tried to kill. This I swear upon the blood already spilled upon these stones." In the embarkation bays, Astartes struck fists against breastplates in a thunderous rhythm. Mortal soldiers shouted, some with genuine fervor, some with terror thinly hidden beneath. Somewhere, a guardsman who had survived the siege of Terra felt his guts twist, knowing that the words meant another hell like the one he had barely escaped. Above Terra, in the strategium of the Phalanx, another meeting took place. Robert Guilliman stood across from Dorn, his blue armor immaculate despite the long campaigns he had been waging to stabilize the Imperium. The Lord of Ultramar regarded his brother with that mixture of respect and exasperation that had always defined their relationship. "You are committing your entire legion," Guilliman said. "You do this at a time when every gene seed, every suit of armor, every bolter is precious beyond diamonds. We are not in the Great Crusade anymore, Dorn. We cannot afford to throw a whole legion at one fortress built by a bitter madman." "Perturabo is more than a bitter madman," Dorn replied. He is a Primarch. He is dangerous as long as he draws breath. He is a symbol to his legion. They will not break while he stands. The seventh is the hammer that breaks such things. That has not changed. Guilliman's jaw tightened. The Codex is almost complete, he said. When it is done, it will be the framework by which we rebuild the legions into something that can survive what is coming. Smaller formations, chapters with their own identities, their own chains of command. No more monolithic forces that can fall in one blow. No more Horus. No more possibility of another treason on that scale. You would cut us into pieces before we are even healed, Dorn said. You would take the seventh, which stood when so many others fell, and scatter it across the stars. I would ensure that never again can a single failure threaten everything, Guilliman answered. Even you, brother, especially you. You drive your sons as you drive yourself, until all that remains is bone and dust. How many will you throw into Perturabo's jaws to satisfy your honor? As many as it takes, Dorn said. Guilliman stared at him. There was no mockery in his gaze now, only sorrow. You will break yourself on that fortress, the Lord of Ultramar said, and you will break your legion with you. Then we will be reforged, Dorn replied. His voice dropped, losing none of its hardness. Pain is the crucible, Robout. You write your codices and draw your perfect formations. I have walked the walls of terror and watched them fall. I know what we are. The seventh is stone and iron and will. We do not bend. We endure or we shatter. And if Sebastus 4 is where we shatter, then so be it. My sons will learn what they must become there, or they will die. He stepped past Guilliman, the conversation done as far as he was concerned. As he reached the Strategium hatchway, he paused for a heartbeat, speaking words so low that only his brother could hear them. This is the pain we deserve, he said. This is how we will be reborn. Then Rogel Dorn, Praetorian of Terror, Lord of the 7th Legion, walked on toward the waiting ships, toward Sebastus 4, toward the cage of iron waiting to close around him and his sons. The translation tore the veil and spat the fleet into reality amidst a graveyard. Shattered moons drifted there. Vast alabaster carcasses cracked into jagged shards that tumbled around Sebastus 4 like the teeth of some devoured god. Irradiated dust clouds glittered with the dying auroras of spent munitions and reactor flares. Hulks of dead ships, traitor and loyalist both, hung in slow procession, their broken hulls venting long frozen entrails of atmosphere and bodies into the hard light of the local star. The night side of the world below burned. Defense beacons winked like baleful eyes, amber and crimson. Macro artillery flashes crawled across the darkness in slow, incandescent rills, each one the birth of a sun-hot firestorm in some unseen valley. Curtain walls of void-shielded bastions pulsed on the auspex as hard, jagged geometries cut into the planet's shadow. The fleet of the Imperial Fists came in disciplined formation, prow lights cold, engines throttled to precise outputs. Battle barges and strike cruisers knife through the wreckage field. Void shields throwing off gossamer veils of energy as debris pattered against them like sleet. Around them clustered the darker shapes of Imperial army transports, Mechanicum heavy movers, mass conveyors bearing the weight of a world's worth of war. There were so many ships that their running lights looked, on first glance, like a second, smaller star cluster hanging over Sebastus 4. On the bridge of the Praetor-class cruiser Stone of Resolve, a captain of the 7th Legion watched the data scroll past on hovering hololiths. The bridge was a vaulted cavern of adamantium ribs and brass-bound consoles, its ceilings carved with reliefs of sieges long past. Servo skulls drifted between workstations, their eye lenses flickering with data. Mortal officers in dark uniforms moved in crisp patterns, their flesh augmented by cogitator jacks and cranial plugs. Around the command pulpit, the shimmering aurora of tactical hollows cast everyone's features in ghostlight. The captain stood bareheaded in his battle plate, helm mag-locked at his belt, one gauntleted hand resting on the rail as he watched the Auspex returns bloom. "Regiment strength inputs complete," an officer reported, his voice steady only because the flesh under his skin had been taught that fear did not matter. "Confirming total Imperial Army and Mechanicum asset muster in this theatre." Numbers cascaded down the nearest display in ranked columns, each line a regiment. Expeditionary infantry, armoured spearheads, siege artillery cohorts, Skitarii phalanxes, Titan support groups. Billions of men and post-human battle thralls reduced to figures in green font, the captain's eye. Lens scrolled the total, silently turning the data into an image in his mind. Oceans of men standing to attention in troop bays, tank decks buckling under the weight of massed armor, forger ships full of war machines waiting to descend. He could almost hear the murmur of billions of heartbeats vibrating through the hull. Every regiment was a promise, he thought, and every promise would be written over in red. "Mark all Imperial Army assets as expendable in pursuit of primary objectives," he said. His voice carried across the bridge without effort. "They are honored thereby." The officer did not question. No one in the presence of an Astartes captain did. The captain's gaze shifted to the largest hololithic projection at the center of the bridge. It showed Sebastus IV, overlaid with the augur ghosts of the fortifications that had given this war its name, the Eternal Fortress. Its outline crawled into focus as overlapping Auspex sweeps compiled. Trenches layered upon trenches. Walls nested within walls. Bastions built behind false bastions. Mock strong points constructed solely to draw assault forces into overlapping fields of fire and intersecting kill zones. Tank traps arranged in jagged chevrons, minefields in depth, and beneath it all, heat ghosts of buried galleries and substrata bunkers, kilometers deep, where the true heart of the fortress lay cocooned in ferrocrete and adamantium. "This is where we prove ourselves," the captain murmured, so softly it was almost to himself alone, "or where we are buried and forgotten." Far above him, aboard the phalanx, Rogel Dorn examined the same image. The strategium of the fortress monastery was a ring of light in the void, a circle of projectors casting the war in ruthless detail. Vox choirs chanted status updates. The scent of ozone and incense mixed in the air as tech adepts tended the machine spirits of the augur banks. Officers of the 7th Legion stood at their stations, silent and immovable. Dorn's eyes took in the fortress in a single sweep. He saw the angles of the walls, the way the bastions overlapped, the fault lines and the strengths. He saw where a frontal assault would bog down, where breach points might be forced, where counterattack routes must be hidden. He saw the buried galleries and understood in an instant how the enemy had prepared to survive the hammer blows that would fall from orbit. He recognized the mind that had made this. "He built this for me," Dorn said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent, but there was no admiration in it, only recognition, only a cold, old hatred. On the surface of Sebastus IV, the Iron Warriors drilled their guns. The sky above the Eternal Fortress was a low ceiling of ash and smoke, stained a permanent ochre by the exhausts of 1,000,000 engines. The land was dead. Nothing green grew inside the radius of the outermost trenches. The soil itself had been scraped away and replaced with ferrocrete, slabbing, razor wire, tank traps and minefields. Only the wind moved freely, and even that was constantly shuddering under the percussion of test bombardments. Lines of artillery stood upon prepared platforms, colossal siege mortars, long-barreled macro cannons, racks of missile launchers on swiveling towers. Iron warriors moved among them like iron insects, legionaries in scarred grey plate, helms striped in hazard colors, vox grills rasping clipped orders. Human artillery crews, selected for their endurance and utter expendability, worked the loaders and recoil compensators under their master's gaze. "Reload cycles," a warsmith growled over his vox. "On my mark. First battery, fire, count the heartbeats." The first rank of guns roared, the concussion hammering across the field like a physical blow. Shells the size of battle tanks screamed into the testing grounds beyond, erupting in towering fountains of flame and shrapnel. The aftershock rolled back over the gun. Lines, rattling brass cartridges and rattling teeth. The crews worked, hands flying. Ramrods, locking levers, elevation wheels spun. Powder charges slid into breaches. Rounds were hoisted and slammed. Sweat ran in rivers down faces gone gaunt from labor and fear. Iron Warrior overseers paced behind them, timing every movement. Again, fire! The second volley shattered the air. A slave worker staggered, ears bleeding, but kept loading. He had seen what happened to those who fell behind the tempo. Beyond the guns, another exercise played out. A line of slave soldiers marched toward a marked stretch of ground. They were shackled in ranks, collars of explosive charges linked with thin cables. Some wore the remnants of imperial uniforms. Others were bare-armed workers taken from the labor pits. All carried shock staves or ancient laser guns with discharged packs. None of them expected to live. "Step!" an Iron Warrior barked from a safe remove. They stepped. The minefield woke. The ground erupted in a precise, measured wave of detonations, each blast a bloom of soil and shrapnel and torn bodies. Men vanished in geysers of fire, their limbs and torsos torn apart, their heads severed and flung aside like kicked stones. Blood sprayed in neat arcs. The churned mud became a slurry of flesh and soil and smoking metal. Auspex arrays recorded everything: the pattern of the detonations, the density, the points where blast overlaps were insufficient, leaving gaps where a single man might have lived to cross. Those gaps would be filled. The field would be perfected. The next line of slaves would find no such mercy. In the depths beneath that carefully arranged hellscape, Perturabo walked alone. The command gallery of the Eternal Fortress was a cavern wrought by fusion cutters and sealed in adamantium and concrete. Its ceilings soared high overhead, carved with no decorations save for numbers. The walls were etched with formulae and casualty projections, dense. Streams of script mapping the relationships between firepower, distance, time, and flesh. The air was cool, almost cold, and dry. The only sound was the faint hum of generators and the whisper of air recyclers. Hololithic displays hung in the air like phantoms. Some showed live feeds from the surface. Others showed the star-speckled darkness of orbit. One vast projection dominated the gallery's center, the circular sigil of the 7th Legion, the clenched fist. Perturabo wore his warplate, but no helm. His face was a thing of sharp lines and old bitterness, eyes dark and sunken with the weight of centuries. He held a stylus in his hand, like a sculptor's chisel. He walked to the projection of the fist and regarded it for a long moment. Then, with careful, almost delicate motions, he began to draw around it. He traced a single line at first, a circle. Then he added bars across it, vertical and horizontal, evenly spaced. A cage. He tightened it, adding more lines, more constraints. The fist remained at the center, trapped behind bars of light. 7th Legion, he said softly, you always believed yourselves unbreakable. He added notations at the intersections of the bars. Each mark represented projected casualties. A company here, a battalion there, 100 legionaries in this segment of the trenches, another 100 at this breach point. Around the perimeter, he inscribed equations mapping time to attrition, distance to ammunition expenditure. A warsmith stood at the edge of the gallery, watching. "That is the cage you will build for them?" the warsmith asked. Perturabo did not look away from the imprisoning schemata he was inscribing. "I have already built it," he answered. "Now I write the epitaph." In the void above, aboard ships bearing the yellow of the 7th Legion, chaplains preached. Vox circuits carried their voices into every compartment, echoing down corridors where Astartes knelt in serried ranks and mortal soldiers huddled by their pallets and ammunition racks. The sermons were not gentle. They did not speak of mercy or comfort. "Brothers," a chaplain intoned, his voice made harsh and resonant by his helm's grill. "You have seen the walls of terror. You know what it is to stand where there is nowhere left to fall back to. You know what it is to feel the breath of the arch-traitor upon your neck. You know what it is to bleed, and yet feel that you have not bled enough." His crozius clanged against an altar of scorched metal as he spoke, punctuating each phrase. Now another traitor waits behind the walls he has built. He believes stone and steel will save him from justice. He believes the Emperor has forgotten what he did. We will prove him wrong. Every step you take on that world, every shell you fire, every drop of blood you spill, will be payment against the debt of terror. Among the mortal ranks, men wept openly. Some in remembered terror of the siege, others in a kind of desperate, fanatic relief that there would be another chance to drown their nightmares in righteous slaughter. Many more said nothing at all, hands moving over worn lasgun stocks and bayonet hilts, checking charge levels, measuring knife edges. Their fear had been ground down by too many wars. They knew the future held only more killing or an anonymous grave on a world they had never heard of before. The sermons rolled on. In the Astartes decks, Marines recited the litanies in call and response, voices booming like distant guns. In the army holds, the prayers turned to hoarse shouting, then to a tired quiet. Somewhere, a man who had lied about his age to join the regiments vomited into a mess tin and prayed that Sebastus IV would take him quickly. Through the warp, a different voice strained to be heard. The astropathic choir of the phalanx convulsed under the pressure of the message. Hooded figures writhed in their restraints, sockets bleeding light. Their chamber stank of burned incense and scorched flesh. The soul shock of the Astronomicon was a constant low roar in their minds. This message came through that storm like a knife. 1,000 light years away, Robert Gilliman had sent a warning. It arrived half-broken, torn by warp tides and interference. Words twisted into one another, images overlaid. The Emperor's realm was a screaming wound in the immaterium now, and nothing passed through it unchanged. Dorn stood in the astropathic gallery as the master of the choir strained to speak the Lord of Ultramar's words aloud. "Brother, not alone, fortress, more than a fortress, cannot expend, entire legion, wait for coordination." Static roared in the master's throat. He forced out more, veins standing out on his temples. "Gilliman, beseech you, do not, Sebastus, without support." The Primarch raised one hand. "Enough," Dorn said. The astropath sagged, smoke curling from the scorched pits of his eyes. Servitors moved in to tend to him, syringes and cautery tools at the ready. Dorn turned away. "Lord," one of his captains ventured, "Gilliman counsels caution. He is not a coward." "He is not," Dorn agreed. "He is what he has always been. Measured, ordered. He sees this as another campaign to be fitted into his designs. Sebastus IV is not a line in his ledger. It is a wound in our honor." He looked back at the hololith of the eternal fortress, at the 8-pointed star cut into the world. "We move to attack schedule advance," he said. "No delay, no coordination. We came here to answer Perturabo's challenge. We will not stand in orbit and debate how best to bleed." The order rippled out through the fleet. Gunnery decks came alive. Macro cannon crews began to load shells in rituals of controlled haste. Servitors shuffling ammunition under the lash of overseers. Lance batteries powered up. Reactors feeding capacitors until they howled with caged energies. targeting cogitators locked onto predetermined coordinates, cross-referencing orbital tracks with topographic data and fortress schematics. The opening salvos of the bombardment began. From orbit, it looked almost beautiful. Lines of light stabbed down from the gun decks, white-hot spears that cut through atmosphere and cloud. Where they touched, the world erupted. Mountain ranges vaporized under concentrated lance fire. Their peaks turned to plasma that rained down as molten glass. Seismic tremors rolled out in concentric waves, toppling lesser structures like toys. Entire hive cities on the far side of the planet collapsed as their foundations turned to slag. Macro shells punched deeper, burrowing into the crust before their warheads detonated. The surfaces of continents rippled like water as subterranean caverns collapsed, fault lines slipped, and oceans boiled in sudden flash evaporation. Shields flared above loyalist-turned-traitor cities as their defense grids tried and failed to hold back the storm. Billions died in those first hours of fire. Many never even knew why the sky had turned to flame. Inside the eternal fortress, the Iron Warriors listened to the world die. Warning runes glowed on their displays as the bombardment registered. Shockwaves rattled outer bastions. Surface-level emplacements vanished under direct hits. Guns and gunners alike erased in incandescent fury. Yet most of the fortress simply endured. The guns that had fired their test volleys earlier were silent now, barrels angled down, their crews withdrawn into hardened shelters. The trenches that had tasted the blood of slave troops lay empty, sandbags and ferrocrete revetments hunkering under the rain of ash. The real life of the fortress had descended beneath the surface into warrens and galleries and wards packed with Iron Warriors, their machines, and their human chattel. Perturabo stood once more in his command gallery, watching the bombardment through filtered Auspex feeds. He saw the arcs of the shells, the angles of incidents, the patterns of impacts marching across the planet's crust. He saw how careful the 7th Legion was being, targeting hardened sites, avoiding certain coordinates, testing for hidden depths. He felt a thin, sour satisfaction. "They are cautious," he said to no one in particular. Even now, even with rage burning their father's heart, they still seek to preserve what they can for their own assault. The warsmith beside him nodded. "They abandoned their advantage," the Iron Warrior observed. "They could scour this world to the mantle, but then they would have nothing left to break themselves against." "Precisely," Perturabo said. "They think like builders. They cannot help themselves. They are always preserving, always calculating how to hold, not how to destroy. That is why he lost Terra. That is why he came here. That is why he will die here." He turned to another hololithic display, this one showing the positions of his own ships in high orbit and high atmosphere. Cruisers and escorts rode the upper reaches, their silhouette markers muted, systems in low power to avoid drawing initial fire. "Order the fleet to hold," he said. "No return fire, no counter battery. Let them believe we are cowed, hiding under our shell. Let them commit everything to this bombardment." The fleet commander's voice came back over Vox, clipped and unquestioning. "As you command, Lord Primarch. Prepare the surface to void silos," Perturabo added. "Prime all atmospheric denial charges. When the 7th Legion thinks the killing is done and the path is clear, we will remind them that the sky itself can be a weapon." Technicians scurried to obey. In bunkers buried deep within planetary crust, machine spirits woke in racks of missiles. Their warheads were not designed for pinpoint strikes, but for saturation. Clouds of flak and radiation, explosive debris, and thermal bloom that would turn the upper air into a choking, lethal medium. Perturabo watched. He could almost see them, those yellow-armored gods of stone, standing on their ships' bridges, watching the world burn and telling themselves that this destruction was controlled. Above, on the Phalanx's flagship escort, Dorn did exactly that. He stood at the observation viewport, a cyclopean slab of armor glass that looked down upon Sebastus 4. The planet turned slowly beneath him, a wounded eye rimmed with fire. Plumes from impact sites stretched into space, thin, ghostly tendrils that curled and dispersed. His hands were clasped behind his back. His armor was unhelmeted, his face bare to the light of the dying world. Outer bastion grids are degraded to projected thresholds, an officer reported from behind him. Our bombardment has reduced surface fortifications outside the Eternal Fortress to acceptable levels of ruin. Acceptable, Dorn repeated, as if there were any measure that could make such devastation acceptable. He watched a mountain range on the planet's horizon collapse as a final lance strike cored it. The plume rolled out in slow motion, kilometers of rock boiling upward before falling back in slow, lethal rain. "Begin preparation of the first wave," he said. Vox traffic exploded across the fleet. Drop pod decks opened their doors. Rows of cylindrical assault craft waited, clamped into position, each one packed with armored warriors, ready to be fired like bullets from orbit. Tech Marines performed last checks on guidance systems and retro thrusters. Chaplains walked between the pods, Crozius in hand, touching each hull in turn, leaving a smear of consecrated oil and dried blood. Thunderhawks and assault carriers prepared to launch in supporting waves, engines cycling up to screaming pitch. In the troop decks of Imperial Army transports, officers bawled orders above the rising thunder of engines. Men clambered into Vox-rigged harnesses as warning klaxons howled. On the phalanx, Dorn turned from the viewport. "Initiate descent," he commanded. "The 7th Legion will land in force. We will crush what remains of his outer works and drive to the heart." No one on that deck knew that, far below, in the darkness beneath Sebastus 4's crust, Iron Warrior boarding torpedoes had already been winched into launch tubes aimed upward. In cavernous silos carved into the planet's bones, attack craft sat with their engines idling in the black, their hulls painted in shadow-eating umber. Their machine spirits hungered. Iron Warriors clambered aboard, systems checks complete, weapons locked. Kill teams waited in cramped troop holds, chain blades and siege drills in their hands, containing their anticipation with the same iron discipline they brought to their fortresses. They would not fire on the first wave of pods. They would wait until the 7th. Legion had hurled itself into the fire, until the fleet's decks were emptied of their Astartes, until the great ships rode in orbit with their bellies empty of their sharpest fangs. Then, while Dorn and his sons plunged toward the killing grounds of the Eternal Fortress, the Iron Warriors would rise out of the planet's night on pillars of fire to greet the wounded ships above. The cage was closing. Fire fell from the sky like the wrath of a silent god. The ships of the 7th Legion vomited lances and macro shells into the wounded atmosphere of Sebastus 4. Batteries that had been silent during the transit now roared with full-throated violence, their barrels cycling until they glowed ember red behind their cooling shrouds. Each salvo stitched lines of light down through cloud and ash, detonations marching across the face of the world in relentless patterns. Between those stabbing beams of destruction, darker shapes dropped. Thunderhawks, Stormbirds, bulky dropships, and the smaller, brutal cylinders of Astartes drop pods hurled themselves from the bellies of the Imperial Fist's fleet. They fell in waves, each wave a stormfront of warheads and armored flesh. Retro thrusters flared periodically as guidance systems bit into the choking air, keeping the descent vectors aligned. Vox channels crackled with clipped cant and the thunder of pre-battle litanies. On the phalanx, Rogel Dorn gave the order that committed almost his entire strength. "Deploy," he said. "The 7th will strike in full." Tens of thousands of Astartes, the heart and hands of the Legion, were committed in that moment. Companies that had stood on the walls of terror, veterans of Fall and beyond. New bloods barely marked with their first campaign sigils. They descended together, a spear of yellow and black aimed at the heart of the Eternal Fortress. In his pod, a sergeant of the line felt the hull shudder around him as the launch clamps discharged. The crushing hand of acceleration pinned him into his restraints, power armor whining as its servos fought to steady his frame. Red runes flickered across his helm display. Altitude markers, descent speed, vector confirmation. Behind those figures lay the cold certainty that once the retro rockets fired, there would be no turning back. "Remember Terra," the sergeant voxed to his squad. "Remember the walls. We break this fortress, or we do not rise again." "By the Primarch," came the answering growl from 9 throat mics. Above them, the bombardment built toward a crescendo. Macro shells as large as hab blocks screamed into the atmosphere, each one trailing a tail of burning metal. Lance strikes bored into the crust, sending fountains of molten rock skyward. Secondary detonations flashed as munition stores, promethium depots and reactor hearts cooked off. From orbit, it looked like the planet was being flayed, its crust peeled back in glowing strips. On the surface, inside hardened. Bunkers far from the Eternal Fortress, Iron Warrior tech priests watched their own instruments. Glyphs ticked up toward preset thresholds. One, a gaunt figure riveted into a metal harness, turned to his master. "Atmospheric saturation approaching optimal," he rasped through a corrupted Vox grill. "Radiation and thermal bloom will mask primary signatures." His master nodded, hazard-striped helm dipping once. "Then let us close the shutters," the warsmith said. Deep in cavernous silos burrowed under mountain ranges that had never known the touch of civilization, racks of missiles stood ready. Their casings were old, bearing the sigils of forgotten manufactorums, but their warheads were modern nightmare. Thermonuclear charges, sub-munitions designed to scatter chaff, plasma clouds, and sensor-disruptive material. They had been seeded across the world months before, buried in silos that had never fired on an enemy. Until now. Command runes flashed, arming circuits. Closed. Ignition rituals completed. The first wave of atmospheric denial missiles punched out of their silos in pillars of flame, gouging pits in the rock beneath them. They screamed upward, leaving corkscrewing contrails in the already tortured sky. More followed. Dozens. Hundreds. They rose from isolation, from forgotten valleys, from disguised launch sites that bore no outward mark of Iron Warrior occupation. They climbed into the upper atmosphere and bloomed. Thermal pulses washed across the planet like the spill of white light from a shattering sun. Sensor baffles erupted in vast clouds, microscopic particles filling the high air in glittering veils. Radiation spikes surged through auger bands. Electromagnetic interference crackled in storm fronts of invisible energy. On every warship in orbit, Auspex screens suddenly flared white and then black as their feeds were overwhelmed. On the bridge of the Stone of Resolve, the captain's tactical display dissolved into static. "Range and bearing lost," an Auspex officer shouted. Panic pushed down into his gut as his training tried to assert itself. "We have lost all detailed ground return, orbital scans blinded, attempting to filter..." The words choked off as another surge tore through the systems. Vox channels, already crowded with battle cant, erupted into a roar of meaningless distortion. Symbols blurred, then vanished. "Vox net collapsing," another officer cried. "Planetary signals gone, all surface contact lost." Across the Imperial Fist's fleet, the same scene played out. Captains leaned over displays that showed only snow and jagged bursts of color. Tech Marines cursed as machine spirits squealed in pain, systems crashing and rebooting in frantic cycles. Commands shouted into the void came back as howl and screech. The carefully plotted descent trajectories of the drop waves suddenly became blind plunges into a churning, invisible inferno. In his pod, the sergeant felt the first ripple of it. The steady burr of Vox traffic in his ear, went from ordered cadences and litany fragments to a single, ear-splitting shriek. Runes on his display blinked and then reset, locking into emergency configurations. External Auspex feeds died, their data lines slashed away as the atmospheric storm boiled around them. Vox cut. One of his brothers voxed on the short-range squad circuit, his voice sounding small and close inside the sergeant's helm. No contact with fleet, no contact with other pods. We know our mission, the sergeant answered. We know our training. We land, we kill, we advance. That is all we need. Above the boiling skies, in the shadowed debris fields and radiation storms, the Iron Warriors' fleet moved. They had waited in silence as the Imperial fists poured their fire into the world below. Engines had been kept to minimal burn. Vox emissions had been reduced to tight-beamed whispers along laser lines. Their hulls had lurked among the broken moons and dead ships, another part of the wreckage, watching. Now, at Perturabo's signal, they lunged. Cruisers built for brutal close-range engagements flared their engines to full burn. Escorts accelerated like thrown knives, changing vectors with savage, non-linear thrusts. Hidden weapon ports snapped open along scarred hulls, spitting macro shells and boarding torpedoes. On the Phalanx's strategium displays, they appeared as a sudden blossoming of hostile runes. Too close, too many, inside the comfortable depth of what should have been safe orbital space. "Contact!" a Vox officer yelled, his words fighting through the storm of interference. "Multiple enemy vessels translating from shadow. Identification. Iron Warriors. Range. Too close. They are inside our..." The rest vanished in the deep, bone-shaking boom of the first impacts. Macro shells smashed into the void shields of Imperial Fist's ships, sending ripples of light across their force fields. Some shots glanced away into space. Some penetrated, slamming into armor with the force of falling comets. Armor glass viewports crazed and collapsed, venting crewmen into the void. Secondary explosions blossomed along hulls where ammunition stores burst or fuel lines ruptured. Boarding torpedoes, armored spikes with engines strapped to them, punched through the flaring shields in the wake of the heavier shells. They drilled into the hulls like burrowing insects, melter charges at their tips, cutting through meters of metal before disgorging Iron Warriors into the heart of their enemy. In the corridors of the strike cruiser, Vow of Stone, alarms were still howling when the first boarding torpedo burst open. The impact had driven a jagged tube through decks and bulkheads, a scar of torn metal ringed by blackened, molten edges. For a heartbeat, there was only steam and smoke. Then figures emerged from the breach, stooped under the weight of their warplate, weapons already raised. Iron. Warriors, hazard stripes glaring against their steel-grey armor, stormed into the cruiser's spine. "Contact midships! Boarding action! Hostile astarters!" A mortal petty officer screamed into his throat mic. He did not get to finish his report. A bolter round from the leading Iron Warrior caught him in the chest and ripped him apart, the explosive charge detonating inside his torso and turning him into a ruddy mist that spattered the deck and walls. Imperial fists met them head-on. From side corridors and hatches, yellow-armored giants charged into the breach, chain swords roaring. The first clash was like two walls slamming into one another. Chain teeth bit into ceramite and flesh. Power fists swung, meeting in detonations of crackling force. The confined space magnified everything: the thunder of bolt weapons, the grinding buzz of chain blades, the roar of war cries, and the wet thumps of bodies hitting metal. Servo skulls drifted high above, their eye lenses glowing. Their picked capture units recorded everything, floating through the drifting smoke, watching as Astartes hacked and bludgeoned each other at arm's length. The Iron Warriors had sent them deliberately. Perturabo wanted to see this, to study it, to measure every motion and scream. The corridors became killing grounds. Imperial fists fought like cornered beasts, giving ground only when piles of their own dead made further advance physically impossible. They fell back by inches, forming new firing lines behind hastily erected cover, only to be smashed again by breaching drills and melter cutters that turned bulkheads into slag. Across the fleet, the pattern repeated. One ship after another felt the bite of Iron Warrior boarding claws. If the initial impact did not break them, boarding parties tried to. Those vessels that could no longer hold their ground or their hull integrity began to pull away, engines flaring hard as they tried to break orbit entirely, trading the support of their comrades for the slim chance of survival. On the bridge of the Stone of Resolve, a mortal fleet officer watched his tactical display disintegrate. Hostile runes bloomed across it in crimson, friendly icons winked out with sickening rapidity. Each vanished marker represented a ship crippled or destroyed, its ability to deliver supporting fire to the surface stripped away in an instant. The officer's throat was dry, his fingers white on the edges of his console. "They are taking us apart," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Ship by ship, deck by deck. He thought of the thousands of Astartes already on their way down, burning through a sky that was now a blind, radioactive storm. He thought of the mortal regiments still awaiting deployment, of the carefully stacked plans that were collapsing in seconds. "Our fire support grid," he began. The words turned into a final grunt as the deck lurched under his feet. An internal explosion tore up through the bridge like the fist of an angry god, hurling consoles and crewmen into the air. There was a flash of searing light as something vital ruptured below, and then the entire command deck was simply not there anymore, replaced by open vacuum and a spreading cloud of crystallizing blood. The Stone of Resolve turned slowly in space, its spine broken, venting fire and corpses. Below, on Sebastus 4, the drop pods hit. They fell through the blinding haze of the upper atmosphere in silence, retro rockets firing in pre-programmed bursts, guidance vanes shifting minutely as their machine spirits tried to keep track of ground that no longer showed true. Auspec's blackout meant they landed not on carefully surveyed approach vectors, but in the approximate coordinates fed to them before the storm. For some, that was enough. They slammed into rock and ferrocrete, crushing anything beneath them, and deployed as they had been built to do. For others, it was a death sentence. Pods meant to land, behind ridgelines or in depressions, fell instead into the teeth of pre-sighted artillery. Their descent trails were picked up by Iron Warrior rangefinders as momentary flares in the murk. Batteries that had lain silent during the orbital bombardment woke with savage enthusiasm. Heavy shells, timed to split the air as the pods touched down, fell in tight salvos. A cluster of pods struck in what their riders thought was a blind valley. The first smashed into the ground, impact petals blowing, hatches igniting. The second was still half a meter above the surface when the barrage arrived. The air turned solid with detonations. The pod's hull crumpled under the shock, its armor splitting. Its occupants were smashed around inside their restraints like toys. Fire poured in through ragged rents, filling the compartment with savage heat. No one inside had time to scream before it became an overpressured coffin. Pods that survived the initial barrage opened to reveal a world gone mad. Astartes emerged into storms of tracer fire. Shells tore great gouges in the ground around them, showering them with rock and metal fragments. Machine gun nests that had played dead during the bombardment spat out converging storms of rounds, hammering at ceramite plate. Mortar bombs fell in steady, almost rhythmic patterns, blasting craters that filled with blood and fragments of armor. Entire companies stepped out into kill zones that had been mapped down to the pace. They were cut down in ranks, some before they could even clear their pod doors. Bolters roared in answer, but it was like trying to shout down a hurricane. In the midst of the first wave, the pod bearing Rogel Dorn screamed down. It hit harder than any of the others, its mass heavier, its machine spirit more stubborn. It struck the fractured ground in a storm of pulverized rock and dust, retro thrusters burning out in a brilliant flare. Impact petals blew outward, ploughing trenches through the dirt. Dorn stepped into hell. Tracer lines stitched the air around him, bright threads of death seeking targets. The sky boiled with smoke and ash. The ground was already littered with bodies, yellow and grey and the dull colours of mortal soldiery, all ground together. A shell fell close enough to lift him bodily off his feet, its blast wave slamming into his armour like an angered god. He took one staggering step, planted his boots, and stayed upright. A brother lay half buried in the smoking crater that shell had opened. His armour was cracked, his helm torn away, one arm gone at the elbow. He scrabbled at the rubble with his remaining hand, trying to drag himself free. Dorn moved without thought. He waded through the flying debris, gauntlet closing around the wounded Astartes' gorget. With a grunt, he hauled the marine out of the crater as if he weighed no more than a child. The brother's legs dangled limp, armor scored and torn. "On your feet!" Dorn snarled. The wounded Astartes tried. His ruined limbs would not answer. His helm lenses, one cracked, one blind, turned up toward his Primarch. "Lord, I cannot." "Then you crawl behind our line and you live," Dorn said. "You do not die here on your back like carrion. Do you understand me?" "Yes," the brother whispered, the word little more than breath. Dorn set him down behind the shattered bulk of a drop pod, where at least some of the incoming fire would be deflected. Then he turned to face the chaos again. "Imperial fists!" he roared. His voice cut through the din, amplified by his armor's vox projectors, until it rolled across the torn landscape like thunder. "To the line! Form ranks! Advance!" There was no question of falling back. There was nowhere to fall back to. Behind them lay only the shattered landing zone and the burning rain of shells. Ahead, the eternal fortress reared like an angular nightmare, its outer works a jagged skyline of bunkers and towers and ramparts bristling with guns. With long habit and drilled instinct to guide them, fist formations began to cohere. Squads rallied to their sergeants, sergeants to their captains. Companies formed up in broad fronts, overlapping arcs of fire covering one another as they pushed forward. Without fleet vox to coordinate them, they relied on pre-arranged battle cant and visual signals. Flare rounds were fired to mark positions. Banner poles were raised amid the storm, Legion icons whipping in the ash-choked wind. They advanced in 4 company fronts, as doctrine dictated for a frontal siege breach. They walked into minefields they had not been told about. Explosions ripped among them, tossing ceramite-clad bodies into the air. Some landed whole and rose again, armor cracked but spirits unbroken. Others landed in pieces. Still the formation closed ranks and advanced. Bolters barked, returning fire at muzzle flashes in distant bunkers. Heavy weapons crews set up in the shelter of shattered rock outcrops, their lascannons and missile launchers spitting spite at iron warrior emplacements. Among the mortal regiments, chaos reigned. They had descended in bulk dropships, the big, ugly slabs of metal going down through the same blind atmosphere as the Astartes pods. Many had not even made it to the ground, torn apart by missile impacts or blown off course to crash into mountainsides. Those that survived spilled their human cargo into a landscape raked by artillery. Guard officers screamed orders that could not be heard over the impact of shells. Men clustered around the hulks of their transports, using them as cover until those hulks drew too much fire and were transformed into molten traps. Those who could move pushed inland, following in the wake of the Astartes, trusting that where the gods of war walked, there was at least some chance of punching a hole through the storm. Far below the forward trenches, in a bastion buried under tons of reinforced concrete and armored plating, Perturabo watched the first yellow-armored figures enter his overlapping templates. The command chamber trembled faintly as the bombardment overhead rolled on, but its walls held. Hololithic displays filled the air before him. Aerial picts, captured by hardened servo skulls. Ground-level feeds relayed from forward observing posts. Auspex returns from buried sensors. Each showed a different slice of the battlefield. Together, they formed a single, terrible picture. He saw pods bursting open under shell fire. He saw squads forming up, banners rising. He saw Dorn himself, identifiable even through smoke and static, striding through the maelstrom at the head of his sons. Beside each live feed, numeric projections scrolled, constantly updating. Attrition rates, ammunition expenditure, time to contact estimates, casualty probabilities. Perturabo let his gaze travel across them like an artist assessing his work. He saw that the atmospheric denial strikes had done their work. The fleet above was blind and beleaguered. The fire support that should have nurtured this planetary assault was being cut away, ship by ship, in the cold void. On the surface, the 7th Legion had landed deep enough that withdrawal would be slaughter. They were committed. The warsmith to his right shifted, armor plates grinding softly. "They are in the fields," he reported. "Multiple company-level formations advancing on sectors Gamma and Epsilon. Estimated strength, significant." Perturabo inclined his head. His eyes did not leave the displays. "Then we begin," he said. He lifted one hand, gauntlet fingers moving in a short, precise gesture that closed a series of command runes on the console before him. "Commence the dissection," Perturabo ordered. Tank by tank, squad by squad. On the surface, guns that had been waiting woke as one. The Eternal Fortress answered. The Eternal Fortress answered, and it answered in iron. The first, armored thrusts of the 7th Legion moved out under a sky that still burned. Land raiders rumbled forward, their tracks chewing the broken earth into black mud and powdered bone. Predators growled alongside them, turrets swinging in precise arcs, Auspex blinded by the storm above, but still hungry for targets. Behind them came Rhino transports and the heavy shapes of siege tanks, all wrapped in a crawling halo of infantry, yellow armored giants advancing at a ground-eating lope. They moved in formation, as doctrine demanded. Assault wedges pushed toward the apparent gaps in the outer line, where the trenchworks were less dense and the minefield markers thinner. Cogitators had marked those channels as the best approach routes, the least wasteful paths toward the walls. Dorn's captains had studied the schematics, cross-checked them against what their helm lenses could see through the smoke and dust, and committed their armor accordingly. The ground seemed clear. That was the first lie. A land raider named Stone Oath led one of the spearheads. Its command throne was occupied by a veteran of terror, a man who had crushed world eaters under its treads and laughed as demons clawed impotently at its adamantine hull. He watched the world through auger slits and spirit-linked displays, one hand resting on the hilt of the power sword mag-locked at his side, the other gripping the command throne's rails. "I want continuous Auspex sweeps," he voxed to his crew. "Even blind data is better than no data. Any anomaly, any spike, you call it." "Acknowledged," came the gunner's reply. "Forward sponsons tracking. Lascannons hot, heavy bolters in suppression pattern." The Land Raider ground on into the channel. To left and right, jagged walls of pulverized rock and ferrocrete rose like broken teeth, funneling the armor column. The path itself was relatively flat, a churned mix of soil and shattered stone that had been compacted by the earlier shelling. Here and there, the ground bore the black, glassy scars of lance strikes. No obvious trenches, no obvious mines, no obvious guns. "Seems they forgot this corner," one of the crew muttered on the internal circuit, and the commander felt the old itch of unease between his shoulder blades. The Iron Warriors forgot nothing. The Land Raider rolled forward another length of its own hull. The world erupted. Mines buried 2 and 3 strata deep detonated in a rising chain reaction. The first blast lifted the stone oath bodily, throwing its prow up, tracks spinning in the air. The next charges went off under its exposed belly. Shaped melter warheads burned through the armor from below, turning plates that had withstood orbital fire into molten spray. The machine spirit screamed in binary rage and pain as its internal organs boiled. Inside, the commander felt everything tilt. His restraints dug into his chest like iron bands. Warning runes flared bloody red across his eye. Lenses, each one screaming a different doom. Heat crashed in as the lower decks turned into a furnace. "Comp," he began, but the word was lost in a rush of fire. The stone oath came down on its side, tracks snapping, one sponson sheared off entirely by the blast. Its hull ploughed a trench through the ground before grinding to a shattered halt. Flames jetted from its exhausts and from the holes punched in its underside. Hatches blew outward under pressure, armored slabs tumbling away in a roar of escaping atmosphere and smoke. Behind the stone oath, other tanks were dying. What had looked like open channel had been measured and mined with obscene care. Melter charges shaped like fragments of rock, Promethium tanks buried with their lines disguised as roots, anti-tank mines layered so that the first explosion would trigger the second and the third in turn. Predators lost their tracks as if some giant had plucked them away. Rhinos simply vanished into rising columns of dust. And fire, their thin armor no protection at all against the underworld of charges waiting beneath them. In some cases, the traps were more primitive, but no less lethal. Hull-down positions for Iron Warrior tank destroyers had been cut into the channel walls, camouflaged and shielded from the initial bombardment. Now their guns spoke. Armor-piercing rounds punched through side plates and engine housings, igniting fuel, cooking ammunition. One Imperial Fist's siege tank took 3 such hits along its flank and blew apart. Its turret spun into the air like a tossed coin, trailing its crew's bodies in a burning arc. The spearheads faltered. Immobilized wrecks clogged the lanes, turning sleek assault formations into ragged, interlocked piles of burning metal. Tanks behind piled into the crippled machines in front, tracks grinding against twisted armor. Smoke thickened, mixing with the omnipresent dust, turning the channels into choking tunnels where visibility shrank to a few dozen. Meters. That was the moment the Iron Warriors chose to rise. Hidden bunkers that had lain flush with the ground until now split open like wounds. Hatches disguised as slabs of broken stone fell away. Iron Warriors surged up from trenches cut into the channel walls, from foxholes nestled behind the hulks of destroyed tanks, from camouflaged firing pits whose doors had looked like nothing more than shattered armor fragments. They came with crack grenades hanging from their belts and melter charges already armed in their hands. A squad clambered up onto the cracked flank of the stone oath. Their boots rang on its hull. One paused to plant a melter charge over a Lascanon sponson that was still trying to track targets, the weapon's spirit too damaged or enraged to recognize that it no longer had a clear field of fire. Another stomped across the top, found the primary hatch, and slapped another charge in place. Inside, the remnants of the crew tried to respond. The commander, half-cooked in his throne, reached for the hatch release with fingers that no longer obeyed. A gunner, his legs crushed by a dislodged armor plate, dragged himself toward an emergency panel, leaving a glistening trail. The melter charges went off together. The stone oath's hull did not explode so much as sag. Metal that had been firm enough to deflect fortress cannon fire turned to liquid and ran in sheets, dripping down in glowing curtains. The interior became a single burning cavity. Flesh and bone simply ceased to exist. Around it, other tanks suffered the same fate. Iron Warriors moved with methodical efficiency, marking immobilized vehicles for destruction, moving past those already clearly dead. Their armor was scarred and blackened, some carrying fresh dents from near misses, but they advanced like a machine that had been perfectly calibrated to this environment. Above the wreck-choked channels, Iron Warrior artillery walked its barrages back and forth across the pinned infantry. Shells fell in measured, coldly regular patterns. One salvo would bracket a knot of Imperial fists caught in the open between the disabled tanks. The next would shift drop points by the exact width of a man's stride, catching those who had tried to run. Shrapnel scythed through ceramite, ripping off limbs, punching through joints. Mortal soldiers were torn apart in droves, their bodies shredded into unrecognizable gobbets of meat that spattered across the bright yellow of Astartes' armor. The shells did not stop to allow for the advance of the Iron Warriors. Their trajectories and timings had been calculated long before. Traitor legionaries moved through the barrage, as if it were part of the landscape, stepping around craters that would be there, passing through gaps that had been pre-measured. In one sector, a trench line had already been smashed flat by the storm. The remains of ferrocrete bulwarks jutted from the ground like broken ribs. The trench itself was a trough filled with mud that was more blood than soil, its floor layered with corpses, some whole, some in parts, all coated in the same red-brown grime that made them almost indistinguishable. The air was thick with the stench of propellant, burned flesh, and opened bowels. Into this ruin came Rogel Dorn. He hit the front of the trench like a meteor, his bulk shouldering aside the ragged remains of the squad that had held there. His thunderhammer rose and fell, a blur of ceramite and crackling power. Each swing smashed a gap in the busted bulwark, pulverizing ferrocrete into grey dust and splinters. Under repeated blows, the barrier gave way, collapsing inward in a cascade of stone. "Forward!" he roared, his voice a bellow that cut through the noise of the bombardment. Through them, not over them. Iron warriors surged to meet him, chainswords snatching at the air, bolters barking. The first traitor Astartes to reach him tried to bring his blade down in a two-handed chop. Dorn caught the blow on his gauntlet, turned it aside, and crushed the Iron Warrior's helm in his free hand, fingers closing with such force that metal and bone alike gave way. He flung the twitching body aside and stepped into the gap he had made, laying about him with his hammer. Every impact was catastrophic. Traitor legionaries flew from the path of his blows, their torsos caved in, limbs pulped. When the hammer struck the ground, shockwaves rippled outward, knocking lesser men off their feet, collapsing firing steps. A bunker entrance heaved and then collapsed entirely when he brought the weapon down on its roof, entombing the screaming defenders inside under tons of rubble. Dorn waded through chainsword duels as if they were no more than underbrush. He shouldered past locked blades, backhanded foes away with blows that dented their armor and broke their spines. His own plate was scorched from near misses, scorings from shrapnel etched across the yellow like new battle honors. Traitor blood ran down his greaves in sheets, sparkling black in the intermittent light of explosions. His sons poured after him. Imperial fists, vaulting the collapsed bulwark, found themselves in close quarters carnage. Trench sections that had once been ordered firing lines were now narrow channels filled with bodies, where movement meant stepping on fallen brothers and enemies alike. Bolters were almost useless in spaces so tight. Chainswords and knives did the work here. "Squad Aurelius, on me!" a sergeant snapped, voice clipped and razor sharp. "Form wedge, cut through to the junction. No halt for retrieval." "Gene Seed, Sergeant?" one of his warriors voxed, glancing down at a fallen brother whose chest had been ripped open by a crack blast, ribcage laid bare, the ruined black carapace visible amidst meat and shredded armor. The sergeant did not pause. He drew his combat blade in one smooth motion, plunged it into the corpse's chest, and sawed through the broken bone. "Extract and advance," he said. His gauntleted hand plunged into the cavity. Fingers closed around the slick, hard shape of the progenoid gland. He tore it free in a fistful of viscera, slapped it into a storage file hanging from his belt, and moved on as another brother stepped in to keep the line of advance clear. Behind them, A mortal auxilia trooper slipped in the blood and went under, trampled without comment as the Astartes pushed forward. Mountains of bodies grew along the trench lines. Piles of dead men, mortal and Astartes both, reached up past the firing steps. In places, the combatants walked no longer on the trench floor, but on a layer of corpses, the ground spongy underfoot, armor slipping on exposed organs and slick bones. Every step left footprints stamped in blood and meat. Sniper fire reached out from distant nests, picking off sergeants as they raised their blades to signal, sending them tumbling backward with smoking holes in their helms. Artillery shells still fell, not in the dense patterns of the opening salvos, but in harassing bursts that smashed whatever semblance of shelter remained. Yet the 7th Legion pushed on, deaf to anything but their own commands and the constant roar of battle. Farther back from the immediate killing grounds, an Iron Warrior's warsmith watched the advance through a slit in his armored observation post. The slit gave him a narrow but carefully chosen view across 3 overlapping kill zones. He saw the yellow-armored figures pushing forward, taking cover where they could, smashing through where they could not. In the first zone, half a company had already fallen, their bodies littering the craters and low walls. In the second, the survivors had been pinned for a time, crouching behind the wrecks of their own vehicles. In the third, what remained of the company was still moving, still closing the distance to his forward bunkers. "Report ammunition status," he voxed. "Outer. Trenches, autocannon crews at less than half loads," came the reply, over a channel filled with the crackle of static and the distant thunder of guns. "Heavy bolter teams requesting resupply. Crack stores at critical. We have expended almost everything we brought forward." The warsmith's lip curled. "You are telling me you are running out of bullets to kill the same warriors over and over," he said. "How many did you count falling in Sector Delta?" 3 full squads, by visual," the gun captain answered. "Yet there are still that many again, and more coming up behind them. They do not stop, Lord. They do not break." The warsmith watched a fist go down under 3 simultaneous hits, his armor pocked and shattered, his helm bursting. For a heartbeat, the Marine tried to rise anyway, gauntlets scrabbling at the churned ground. Another shell burst nearby, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of him but a smear across the trench wall. Behind he had fallen. Another Imperial fist stepped into his place, raising his bolter, advancing as if nothing had changed. "Stubbornness masquerading as honor," the warsmith muttered. "Wasteful." He might have been disgusted. He might have been impressed. It was hard to tell where one emotion ended and the other began. Deep below, Perturabo cared less for how it looked than how it tallied. In his command bastion, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors stood before a bank of displays, hands clasped behind his back. Numbers crawled across the screens, updating in real time. Each figure was measured in lives, in shells, in minutes. Casualty estimates for each corridor of the fortress, ammunition depletion rates, projected time until specific sectors would become untenable. He read them like a priest reading a devotional text. "Outer Ring Sector Alpha," intoned an adjutant. "Imperial Fists casualties, estimated 3 companies and change. Mortal auxiliary casualties, uncountable. Iron Warriors losses, 1.5 companies. Ammunition expenditure at projected levels. Enemy advance slowed, but not fully checked." "Sector Gamma?" Perturabo asked. 2 companies of the 7th Legion destroyed in the approaches. A 3rd committed and currently engaged in trench fighting. We are approaching projected attrition, midpoint for that salient. Another warsmith, helmet tucked under his arm, cleared his throat. "Lord," he said, "with respect, these are the conditions under which a counterattack would be decisive. The 7th is overextended in multiple corridors. Their armor has been largely immobilized or destroyed. If we assemble a concentrated thrust and strike them now, we can collapse entire salients, perhaps encircle and annihilate a significant portion of their forward elements in one blow. Perturabo did not turn. "And then?" he asked. "We press the advantage," the warsmith said. "We drive them back from the outer line, force them into their landing zones, bleed them further as their fleet hangs crippled above. We might even break them entirely before they can dig in." Perturabo's gaze remained on the casualty figures. They were beginning to reach the levels he had anticipated. He took a perverse pleasure in seeing how close his projections were to reality. "No," he said. "We do not strike them in one blow. We let them advance." The warsmith blinked, genuinely thrown by the simplicity of the refusal. "Lord, they are the 7th, he said. "They are a legion. They will not stop unless they are forced to." "Exactly," Perturabo replied. "They will not stop. They cannot. Their father will not allow it. If we shatter them here in the outer works, they will die with their honor intact. They will say they were betrayed by superior numbers or some other comfortable lie. They will not learn." He gestured, and one of the displays flicked to show a schematic of the fortress, its rings and corridors and underways. The highlighted paths marked the routes the Imperial fists were currently taking. Every spearhead was driving toward the deeper lines, toward the denser maze of fortifications. "Let them bleed themselves dry along the full length of the blade," Perturabo said. "Tank by tank, squad by squad. We will not waste our strength on a single moment of satisfaction. We will wear them down, sector after sector, until their entire legion is exhausted, their supplies spent, their faith cracked. That is the lesson I have built this cage to teach." The warsmith bowed his head, chastened, even as some part of him still yearned for the brutal simplicity of a crushing counterstrike. On the surface, Dorn's captains gathered in a shattered bunker that had once been an Iron Warrior's command post and now served as a temporary redoubt for the 7th. The bunker stank of burned oil and blood. The walls were pitted with shrapnel damage. A hole in the roof let in a weak red light from the fires outside, and every so often, dust sifted down as another shell struck nearby. A map was spread across a makeshift table, an enemy schemata annotated in the charcoal and blood-stained script of Imperial Fists commanders. They were filthy. Their once proud yellow armor was scorched, layered in grime, smeared with the dark blood of their foes. Some wore field dressings strapped over cracked plates where shrapnel had penetrated, binding not flesh, but broken ceramite. They looked like statues taken from a mausoleum of war and thrown back into battle. "Every time we push through one line, there is another behind it," one captain said, jabbing a finger at the schematic. "They give just enough to draw us in. Then we hit the next wall. Our armor is in ruins. Our heavy guns are running low. If we keep hitting them head-on, we will grind ourselves down before we even reach their internal bastions." "We need to consolidate," another said. "Dig in, reverse the siege. Let them come to us for once. We are the masters of defense. We can turn these same lines against them if we fortify what we have taken." "And wait while their guns and trenches take more of us," another demanded. "You saw what they did to the armored thrusts. We cannot sit in their lanes and expect mercy." "Enough," Dorn said. The word cut through the rising argument like a guillotine blade. He stood at the far end of the bunker, hunched slightly to fit under the low ceiling. His armor was a patchwork of scorched and repainted plates. Blood, traitor and loyalist both, had dried in broad streaks across his chest and arms. His hammer rested against the wall beside him, head stained and cracked with use. "You counsel me to halt," he said quietly, "to dig in and hide behind the walls built by a traitor." No one spoke. "To stop now is to admit that Perturabo has outbuilt me," Dorn went on. "To accept that his fortress is too strong to take by force. That is what you are asking." "We are asking you to preserve the Legion," one captain said, daring much. His voice shook only slightly. "We have lost thousands already. Entire companies are reduced to squads. We will run out of bodies before we run out of his walls. Dorn's eyes burned. We did not stand on terror to learn caution, he said. We did not hold the palace to come here and cringe at the strength of his stone. The 7th Legion is a weapon, not a resource to be balanced in some ledger. We will not sit in his trenches like beaten dogs. We advance. We break him. We break his fortress. Or we die. Those are the only options that do not shame us. He stepped away from the wall, taking up his hammer. Signal the lines, he said. Another mass assault. All forward elements to press their advantage. No withdrawal, no consolidation. We keep moving. Outside, as the order rippled out, Sebastus IV turned, from day to a mockery of night. The sky never truly darkened. The storms of ash and chemical vapor glowed from within, lit by the fires of burning promethium and reactor ruptures. Tracer fire stitched across the gloom in red and white arcs. Flare shells burst overhead, casting skeletal shadows across the trenches as they drifted down. From cracked reactor housings, eerie green and blue light spilled, rippling across pools of coolant and contaminated mud. In that red-tinted half-light, the war changed character. Long-range fire still thundered, but more and more the fighting came down to the width of a trench, the length of a bayonet. Astartes clashed hand-to-hand amid hills of corpses. Chainswords chewed through armor and bone alike, their teeth clogged with meat. Bayonets were driven into gaps in power armor. When those broke or were lost, warriors fell upon one another with knives, with entrenching tools, with their bare hands and teeth. Men went mad in those trenches, not from fear that had burned out of them long ago, but from the sheer, unending pressure of violence. A mortal soldier pressed shoulder to shoulder with others in a firing step, firing his laser gun into the smoke until the barrel glowed dull red, might feel a sudden impact as a shell fragment punched through his comrade's skull, showering him in brain and bone. He would blink, wipe his eyes on his sleeve, and keep firing. If he faltered, a disciplinary officer behind would remind him of his duty at the muzzle of a pistol. Billions died in those days. Imperial auxiliary regiments were fed into the jaws of the Eternal Fortress as readily as promethium into a generator. Iron Warrior slave troops, chained together in ranks, were driven forward at gunpoint to trigger enemy fire and reveal hidden guns. Conscripted laborers, given rifles and a prayer, were thrown against breaches to fill them with their bodies. Their deaths were tallied only insofar as they affected ammunition consumption and movement rates. In the calculus of the 2 legions, the lives of men were simply fuel. Amid that tide, the real war ground on. Imperial Fists companies, reduced from full strength to a handful of battle brothers, held crucial trench junctions against repeated counterattacks. Iron Warriors' kill teams infiltrated newly captured bunkers and erupted from maintenance access hatches to slaughter surprised fists in their moments of exhaustion. Each gain of a few dozen meters of trench cost hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives, but the 7th Legion continued to press inward, deeper into the star-shaped maze. Days bled into each other. Sleep became a rumor. Men measured time not by the turning of any sun. There was no sun to see, but by the cycles of assault and counter-assault, by the rate at which their magazines emptied and were refilled, by the times they were allowed to stop long enough to remove helmets and scrape the coagulated filth from filters and seals. At last, after an assault that seemed to last from one end of eternity to the other, the Imperial Fists broke the outer perimeter. They stormed over a final line of bunkers that had been battered to cracked stumps by their remaining artillery. They flooded into trenches where the last resistance had been torn apart in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. They planted their standards on parapets still slick with blood and looked out over the ground beyond. There should have been another wall of guns waiting, another dense line of trenches, another forest of razor wire and tank traps. That had been the pattern. Instead, there was space. The immediate trenches were empty, their firing steps abandoned. Bunkers lay silent, their doors hanging open, their interiors devoid of life. The trenches beyond were manned, but thinly. The density of fire slackened. Here and there, fallback positions waited, but they were not held in strength. The enemy had withdrawn, leaving skeleton crews to harry any advance. Dorn stepped up onto the battered lip of a trench and looked out. He saw the abandoned outer line stretching away in both directions, its fortifications now behind him. He saw the sparser networks of the inner works ahead, still formidable, still deadly, but not the solid wall of iron he had expected. His helm lenses analyzed, calculated. His tactical acumen, honed over centuries, mapped the routes of advancing columns, the likely choke points, the kill lanes. Understanding came, slow and unwelcome. Perturabo had not been overwhelmed here. He had not been forced back from the outer perimeter by the sheer savagery of the 7th Legion's assault. He had yielded it deliberately. The lines had been held to the exact point where further resistance became inefficient, then thinned out, inviting the fists in. They had bled themselves almost white to take this ring of defenses. And now, with their armor wrecked, their ammunition low, their ranks hollowed out, they were being beckoned deeper into the cage. Dorn's hands tightened on the haft of his hammer until the ceramite creaked. "So," he murmured, "this is how you play it." Around him, his sons cheered the breach. They raised their weapons, voices ragged but triumphant, shouting oaths and litanies. To them, this was a victory. Another wall taken, another step toward their Primarch's promise. Dorn did not join in their exultation. He stared into the depths of the eternal fortress, at the undermanned trenches and the silent bunkers, and felt his fury harden into something colder. Perturabo had built this maze for him. Every meter of ground ahead had been laid out with his mind in mind. Every line of fire calculated not only for maximum death, but for maximum insult. The only way forward was through. To turn back now would be to admit defeat. To halt would be to confess that Perturabo's fortress had broken the 7th. Dorn lifted his hammer. "Forward," he said, voice carrying over the cheers, cutting them short. "We are not finished. This is only the first ring. The cage is larger than this. We go on." And so, battered and bloodied, the Imperial fists stepped deeper into the teeth of the trap that had been waiting for them since the first stone was laid on Sebastus IV. The inner lines of the fortress did not break so much as bend, and Rogel Dorn drove his legion into every flex and opening like wedges of living adamantium. Augur ghosts, fleeting and imprecise through the storm of interference, marked the paths that seemed to lead toward the central bastions. On the strategium projections aboard the phalanx, they appeared as pale arteries of possibility, threads winding through the jagged geometry of the 8-pointed star. On the ground, they were little more than human sight and Primarch instinct, reading the lay of trenches and walls, the thickness of fire, the subtle thinning of resistance. "Advance here," Dorn ordered, stabbing one gauntleted finger toward a cluster of emplaced guns that ringed a bastion like thorns. And here, 3 spearheads staggered. We drive for the heart from every angle. The heart of the star, the center of Perturabo's work. Captured picked slates and tortured auspex had suggested a central command nexus deep within the fortress, a core where the Iron Warrior's logistical nerves knotted together. Dorn seized on that data the way a drowning man seizes a rope. His spearheads moved. The 7th Legion's armored spear was shorter now, its tip blunted by loss. Land raiders that had survived the earlier massacres trundled forward with fresh scars etched into their hulls, and the burned remnants of older paint schemes barely visible under soot. Predators and vindicators were fewer. More and more, the thrusts were built on infantry. Imperial fists companies advanced in assault wedges, banners whipping in the sulphurous winds, heavy weapons braced across shoulders and carried forward at a pace just shy of a run. They plunged into the fortress's deeper works, each spearhead tearing further along one of the star's barbed arms. In plan view, they looked like shards driving inward, but the reality on the ground was messier. Trenches twisted, doubled back, dipped into underworlds of tunnels and sub-trenches. Bastions that seemed minor revealed hidden gun decks once approached. Open ground that promised speed turned out to be killing flats swept by interlocking fire. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the spearheads drifted apart from one another. Coordinating multiple simultaneous thrusts was hard enough in a clean communications environment. Here, with Vox a patchwork of local bursts and shouted relay, it became an exercise in faith. Captains lost track of one another. Units that believed themselves to be advancing in concert on parallel lines were in fact pushing into different corridors of the Star, each segment of the 7th Legion biting down on a different piece of Perturabo's puzzle. Within a day of that renewed push, the Imperial fists were no longer one mass. They were fragments driven into separate petals of the 8-pointed cage, isolated from one another by walls of stone and steel and fire. Perturabo watched the fragmentation with the same satisfaction a dissecting surgeon might feel as muscles and organs parted neatly under his scalpel. He left his deep command chamber without ceremony. The lift that carried him upward hummed through strata of ferrocrete and stone. Its walls were marked with his legion's sigils, the clenched fist of the 7th inverted and nailed beneath the Iron Warrior's own icon. The air grew hotter as he ascended, the distant thunder of battle seeping in through the rock like the pounding of some vast heart. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with trophies. Flayed bodies hung from the walls, arms outstretched, heads drooping, skins peeled back and pinned to display the musculature beneath. Iron, nails pierced wrists and ankles. Some of the corpses were too ruined to identify. Others still bore residue of rank badges or half-melted armor trims that had once denoted warsmiths of the Iron Warriors. Perturabo had had them displayed here as a reminder of failure and as a warning to those who would take their place. He walked past them without a glance. He knew each face already. He had memorized the way each had disappointed him. At the end of the corridor, armored blast doors as thick as a fortress wall rumbled aside. The observation tower beyond was an armored cylinder built into the flank of a bastion that rose above the current front line. From the outside it looked like any other command post, bristling with sensor masts and flak guns. Inside, its walls were lined with scrying devices and auspex banks, hololithic emitters and armored viewports. It was as close to the surface as Perturabo ever allowed himself, and he came here now because he wanted to see the moment his rival realized the full extent of his mistake. "Status," he demanded as he stepped into the tower's center. "Outer ring abandoned according to schedule," a junior warsmith reported. "Imperial fists advance along predicted vectors. Their spearheads are now at these positions." He gestured, and a projection blossomed into the air. The fortress's star geometry unfolded in ghostly lines. Bright yellow volumetric marks indicated the fist's current spearheads. They were, indeed, within reach of the innermost bastions. They were also separate from one another by vast stretches of still hostile trenches and fire lanes. "They have cut themselves apart neatly," Perturabo noted. "Good. Open a channel." "In this interference?" the warsmith asked, not from doubt but from technical concern. "We can barely sustain bursts between adjacent bastions." "Then you will sustain this one," Perturabo said. The communications tech adepts bent their robed forms over, their consoles coaxing the machine spirits to a clarity they did not want to give. Vox arrays howled as they were forced to focus past the static and atmospheric roar. Encryption runes flickered and spun. The signal that emerged from that tortured bandwidth was thin and ragged, but it was enough. Somewhere in the shattered front line, Dorn stood in a captured redoubt, helm tilted as his suit's Vox icon pulsed. "Lord Primarch," a captain said, "we are receiving something. An open hailing channel." "Patch it," Dorn said. The Vox connection crackled into life, stuttering in and out like a dying heartbeat. For a moment it was all static and phantom echoes. Then a voice came through. A voice Dorn had not heard directly since before the heresy. "Rogel," Perturabo said. The single name carried centuries of shared history and enmity. "Perturabo," Dorn answered. The word tasted of ashes. For a few heartbeats they said nothing, the silence filled by the distant roar of artillery and the screams of men. The Vox link flickered, nearly dropping. Tech Marines on both ends forced it back to life with curses and rites. "At last, you choose to speak instead of hiding under your concrete," Dorn said. "I had begun to wonder if there was anything left of you but numbers and stone. And I see there is nothing left of you but stubbornness," Perturabo replied. His voice was calm, only the faintest edge of strain betraying that he was speaking through a storm. "You walked into this cage knowing exactly what it is. You saw the geometry, you understood the implications, you knew the answer, and still you sat the test. You hide in your depths while your legion dies for your pride," Dorn snapped. "Come out and face me, traitor. Or do you fear that your precious sums will not save you from an honest blade?" "Honest blade," Perturabo repeated, almost amused. "You talk of honesty after terror? You defended walls built on lies. Rogel, we both know this." "We defended humanity," Dorn said. "You bombarded it." "Humanity is an equation that never balanced," Perturabo replied. "You are now discovering the same about honor. You wanted pain. I am administering it. You should be thanking me." The Vox shrieked, nearly drowning his last words. Dorn's teeth ground. "If you will not come out, I will dig you out," Dorn said. "I will bring you back to terror in chains of iron, like the cur you are." "Chains," Perturabo said thoughtfully. "Yes, you always did like them." "Very well, brother. You have questioned my courage. I cannot allow such an insult to stand." The channel snapped off, the static collapsing into silence so sudden it left Dorn's ears ringing inside his helm. He lowered his helm, sealed it. Around him, his sons looked to him for orders. "Forward," he said. "There is nothing behind us but shame." On the Iron Warrior side, Perturabo turned away from the now blank Vox display. "Prepare the second line counter-assault," he said. "I will lead it personally." The warsmith at his shoulder hesitated. "My lord, your presence at the front is tactically unnecessary," he ventured. "Our plans do not require—" Perturabo's gaze flicked to him, and the warsmith fell silent. "Rogel thinks me a coward," Perturabo said. "He always has. He imagines that because I understand the value of cover and calculation, I will not stand in the open with bloody hands. We will disabuse him of that notion. Ready my warplate. Assemble the Terminator cadre." He descended from the tower into an antechamber where servitors and tech priests waited. His armor was already there, standing like an iron statue. Forgebreaker rested upon a rack nearby, its massive head still bearing faint traces of Ferrus Manus's craft, its haft etched with the new sigils Perturabo had carved there after the Dropsite massacre. Around it, a harness of strange devices hung, gravitic field generators tuned to subtle signatures encoded to respond to the Primarch's will. The Iron Warriors suited their gene sire in silence, locking rings clamped into place, power couplings engaged with heavy clacks. Plates slid and closed over the fusion of flesh and artifice that Perturabo had become. When they were done, he stood taller, broader, a walking siege engine in his own right. Terminator armored bodyguards waited in the corridor beyond. Each wore thick plates and layered ceramite, hazard stripes framing their helm lenses, Each carried chain fists, siege hammers or combi weapons designed to crack bunkers like eggs. "Forward," Perturabo said. They moved through internal corridors toward a concealed blast door that had so far remained unopened in the fighting. On the other side lay a stretch of trench that, on the tactical readouts, glowed with the yellow of the Imperial fists. The door's seals blew with a thunderous crack. A ramp slammed down onto the trench's firing step. The first the beleaguered Imperial Fists company knew of their arrival was the sudden gust of hot air and dust, and then the dark shapes of Iron Warriors Terminators looming out of the smoke. The company had been holding this section for hours. Their numbers were down to less than half. Helm lenses were cracked, armor blackened and spattered. They had spent bolt rounds until their magazines ran dry, and had been fighting with blades and fists ever since. The trench before their position was clogged with bodies. Their sergeant had lost an arm to a chain blade and continued to fight one-handed. "Contact rear!" someone shouted, incredulous and horrified in equal measure. Then the first chain fist hit. The Terminator's weapon sheared through the chest plate of an Imperial fist as if it were paper, teeth screaming as they cut through ceramite, then ribcage, then spine. The fist's body came apart in two halves, upper torso collapsing, backward, lower half slumping forward. Blood and viscera sprayed across the narrow trench walls. Siege hammers rose and fell, pulverizing helmets and shoulders. Combi weapons fired point blank into faces and torsos, mass reactive shells detonating inside armor. The confined space magnified the brutality. There was nowhere to dodge, nowhere to fall back to, that was not already occupied by dying men. In their midst strode Perturabo. He was a mountain of steel and hatred, forge breakers swinging in wide arcs that stove in parapets and men alike. Where his hammer struck, Imperial fists were reduced to broken, twitching heaps, armor warped into unrecognizable shapes. His armor's gravitic harness hummed with barely restrained power, ready to distort the battlefield to his whims. Dorn felt his presence before he saw him. There was something in the way the enemy hit that particular point of the line. Something in the way the trenches shook, not from artillery, but from the footfalls of something heavy and determined. Through the chaos of vox chatter and the screams of wounded men being trampled underfoot, a single name cut across his consciousness like a blade. "Perturabo," he murmured. He did not wait for confirmation. He did not consult his strategium. He strode toward the sound, hammer in hand, carving a path through the press. The redoubt where they finally met had once been a node in the fortress's internal network, a nexus of trenches and bunkers and fire steps. Now it was a crater rim of broken concrete and piled bodies, its overhead cover shattered, its firing ports blown out. The air hummed with dust and propellant fumes. Guns lay scattered where their crews had died at their posts. An Imperial Fists squad, reduced to a handful of men, was making a last stand near a toppled bastion wall when Perturabo came stomping over the rubble. They turned, weapons up, and for a heartbeat, the sight of him, towering, armor lit by the intermittent flashes of gunfire, hammer in hand, stole even their genetically enhanced breath. "Form on me!" their sergeant shouted. They did, because they were Imperial Fists, and there was nothing else to do. Perturabo waded into them without breaking stride. Forgebreaker rose and fell, its mass augmented by his own unnatural strength. One fist tried to parry the blow with his shield. Hammer met shield, and the shield might as well have been paper. The Marine vanished in an explosion of mangled armor and meat, fragments of his body fanning out to spatter his brothers. Dorn arrived as the last of that squad died. He came up through a side trench, vaulting a broken length of parapet, his own hammer gripped in both hands. For a moment, the two Primarchs simply stared at one another through the haze. They were brothers, stamped with the same impossible human template, yet shaped by different forges. Dorn was tall and broad, his armor scored and stained, but still carrying the echoes of imperial gold. Beneath the yellow, his features were harsh, angular, set in lines of iron resolve and grief. Perturabo was heavier, his frame layered in iron and brass, his face marked by a perpetual scowl of bitterness, his eyes dark pits under a brow that seemed carved from basalt. "You came," Dorn said. "You begged," Perturabo replied. The distance between them vanished. Hammer met hammer with a crack like a thunderclap. The shockwave smashed outward, flattening nearby trench walls and hurling lesser men from their feet. The bastion ruins shuddered as if in an earthquake. Armor plating on both Primarch's gauntlets cracked under the transmitted force. They parted, circled, and came together again. Forgebreaker swept in a horizontal arc. Dorn ducked under it, his own hammer driving for Perturabo's ribs. The Iron Warrior twisted, gravitic packs flaring for an instant to alter his momentum, and the blow that should have crushed his side instead slammed into the ground, pulverizing Ferrocrete and throwing up a hail of shards. Every missed strike was an environmental catastrophe. A swing that went wide smashed into the remaining wall of a bunker, collapsing it onto the defenders and attackers alike, burying them under tons of debris. A downward blow that was turned aside by a parry continued into the trench floor, sending shockwaves racing down the corridor, bursting eardrums, turning knee joints to jelly and mortal soldiers unfortunate enough to be standing nearby. Imperial fists and iron warriors tried to clear the space around their sires, but the battle did not allow neat rings or respectful dueling grounds. Men were dragged into the vortex of the Primarch's struggle, whether they willed it or not. One iron warrior charged to bolster Perturabo's flank, only to be caught by the backswing of Forgebreaker and reduced to a spray of armor fragments and steaming meat. An Imperial fist lunged to strike at the traitor Primarch's back and was kicked aside with contemptuous force, his chest imploding under the impact. Perturabo fought like the siege master he was, using control of distance and angle as weapons. His gravitic harness flared at key moments, making Dorn's hammer strikes fall short by hairbreadths, or dragging the Imperial Fist Primarch off balance, just enough that his footing faltered in the gore-slick trenches. Dorn fought like the wall itself, each blow a denial, each block an absolute refusal to yield. At one point, Dorn saw an opening. Perturabo overextended, bringing Forgebreaker around in a wide arc that crumpled an entire section of trench wall. Dorn stepped inside the swing, his own hammer rising. For a heartbeat, he saw the iron grey of his brother's helm filling his vision. He brought the hammer down with all the force he could muster. Perturabo's gravitic devices screamed. The air around Dorn thickened into a crushing mass. Invisible hands grabbed at his limbs, twisting them, dragging them sideways. The hammer blow that would have smashed Perturabo's helm glanced off, gouging an ugly rent in his pauldron instead of his skull. In the same motion, Perturabo reached out, caught Dorn by the gorget, and turned his own gravitic field into a sling. For an instant, Dorn was weightless. Then Perturabo hurled him. The Imperial Fist Primarch's massive form became a projectile. He went through a ferrocrete blast wall as if it were paper, his body punching a Dorn-shaped hole in the material. Fragments of stone and steel exploding outward. Behind the wall lay a trench, already waist-deep in blood and broken bodies. Dorn hit the far side of it, smashing armor first into the opposite parapet. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, made the world lurch and spin. He slid down into the trench like a fallen statue. For a heartbeat, he disappeared beneath the floating muck. Blood, water, viscera, shredded uniforms and armor debris closed over his helm. The weight of corpses pressed in from all sides. He might, briefly, have known what it was to drown in the same filth his sons waded through. He rose. He erupted from the mass of corpses and gore like some vengeful spirit, blood sheeting off his armor, bone fragments cascading from his pauldrons. Cracks had spiderwebbed across his breastplate. One of his shoulder trims hung loose, knocked half off. Warning runes flickered at the edges of his vision, indicating damage to multiple systems. He ignored them. Dorn's fury had hardened past heat into something cold and diamond-sharp. He looked up at the bastion, whose wall he had been thrown through. Its structure was already compromised, hammered by artillery, undercut by tunneling blasts. He saw the fractures, like someone else might see lines on a plan. He saw where a strike would bring the whole thing down. He climbed. Imperial fists and Iron Warriors alike scattered or were smashed aside as he hauled himself up the trench wall and onto the bastion's remains. Perturabo, crossing the gap with the implacable tread of a siege engine, saw him and braced, Forgebreaker's head coming up, eyes narrowing. Dorn did not come straight for him. Instead, he drove his hammer into one of the shattered bastion's remaining support pillars. Stone and steel that had held for days under bombardment could not withstand that focused impact. The pillar exploded, shards fanning out. The load it had borne shifted. Cracks raced across the bastion's bulk. Dorn swung again and again, hitting the structure's weak points like a master demolitions expert. Each blow was delivered with the full strength of a Primarch, each one accompanied by a detonating flare of power field and a bellowed oath. The bastion groaned. Its upper levels began to tilt. Perturabo understood his intent a heartbeat too late. The bastion collapsed. It came down in a roaring avalanche of ferrocrete, rock, sandbags, and anchored weapon platforms. The observation decks, the firing, steps. The corridors where Iron Warriors had hunkered down to pour fire into the advancing fists. All of it turned into a tumbling mass. Men screamed as they were crushed. Guns bent and snapped. Ammunition stores cooked off, adding secondary explosions to the chaos. Perturabo vanished beneath the falling tower. Dorn threw himself clear at the last instant, leaping into the trench he had just clawed his way out of. Debris crashed down around him, smashing bodies into paste, driving the level of blood and mud higher. A slab of fallen wall hit his back like a hammer, driving him down to one knee. The world became fire and dust. Silence fell in the immediate area, sudden and shocking. Imperial fists crouched behind whatever cover they could find, panting, helm lenses dimmed by dust. Iron Warriors, those who had survived, stared at the pile of rubble where their Primarch had been a moment before. For a heartbeat, both sides dared to hope. Then the rubble moved. Blocks of concrete shifted, rolled aside. A rent opened in the collapsed mass, chunks tumbling down. Through it stepped Perturabo. His armor was torn. One pauldron hung in jagged pieces, exposing the layered plating beneath. His helm was dented, one eye lens cracked into a spiderweb of fractured glass. Dust coated him from head to foot, turning his hazard stripes into pale smears. Forgebreaker's head was chipped, its metal blackened. He laughed. It was a hoarse, joyless sound, more like a cough dragged out far too long, but there was genuine mirth in it, the bleak amusement of a man who had expected nothing but disappointment and, for once, had found an adversary worthy of his attention. "Better," Perturabo called across the devastation, Vox amplifying his voice. "Better. You are learning to use the battlefield, Rogel. Perhaps this cage will teach you more than I thought." He trudged forward through the rubble, each step sending more debris sliding down. Around them, the slaughter did not pause. Imperial fists and Iron Warriors were locked in their own intimate wars. Brothers in ceramite grappled at arm's length, combat blades buried to their hilts in joints and throats, entrenching tools rising and falling like butcher's cleavers. A fist with both legs blown off dragged himself toward an Iron Warrior, knife gripped in his teeth, trying to close the last meter between them. An Iron Warrior, with his lower jaw torn away, gurgled through a ruined throat as he thumbed the detonator on a satchel charge, taking 3 enemies and himself into fragments. Artillery shells still fell, oblivious to the presence of demigods. One burst so close to the dueling Primarchs that its blast wave bent their armor, sending cracks racing through the already compromised ground. A basilisk shell aimed at a cluster of retreating mortal troops fell short and detonated in a trench full of fighting Astartes, sending yellow and grey bodies alike spinning through the air in bloody arcs. Orbital bombs, dropped blind through the interference by ships fighting their own desperate battles above, struck further out. Their impact shook the entire fortress. Shockwaves rippled through the trenches. Men lost their footing and fell, were trampled, were unable to rise before another bombardment swept over them. Perturabo felt those distant impacts through the soles of his boots. He judged the tremors, the way the shockwaves flowed through the rock. Enough. He had made his point. He had shown his brother his face. He had demonstrated that he was no coward cowering in a deep bunker. More importantly, he had allowed the 7th Legion to drive so far into his works that retreat would now cost them more than pressing on. His fleet above had savaged their ships. His fortress below had bled their companies dry. The cage did not need him to stand in the open any longer. He broke away. Forgebreaker swept out in a wide arc, not at Dorn himself, but at the ground between them. Impact blew a crater, hurling rubble and bodies into the air, forcing Dorn to raise his hammer in a guard that shielded him from the worst of the flying debris. When his vision cleared, Perturabo was already moving back into the rubble, his Terminator guard forming a living wall around him. "Running again," Dorn growled, voice thick with dust and promise. "Leaving you with what you wanted," Perturabo's voice came back faintly, carried on the local vox. "Pain." He triggered the preset charges. Throughout the fortress, detonators closed circuits that had been waiting since before the first Loyalist shells had fallen. Mines that had never been stepped on exploded. Demolition charges buried under captured bunkers went off, turning what the Imperial Fists thought were secure strongpoints into coffins. Trenches that had been carefully undercut by sappers collapsed along their lengths, turning into sudden, yawning chasms. Whole sectors of the battlefield gave way. Imperial Fists, who had fought their way into forward positions, felt the ground drop out from under them. They fell into pits of fire and smoke as the underworks were blown, and Promethean rivers ruptured to pour down into the new-made gullies. Men died screaming as they were buried alive or immolated. Forward lines that had just been established were severed from their supports, shoulders of the salients crumbling, leaving isolated islands of yellow armor surrounded by seas of ruin. Connecting trenches collapsed, cutting Vox cable lines and physical routes alike. Where there had been a ragged but contiguous front, there were now separated pockets of resistance, marooned in a sea of hostile fortifications. In one such collapsing sector, Dorn went down with his sons. The bastion whose fall he had engineered had been the key to this particular section's structural integrity. With it broken, the rest of the local trench network began to slump. A crack opened under his boots, widening in a heartbeat. The world tilted. Rubble and bodies slid into the widening fissure. Dorn plunged into darkness under a rain of stone. He was buried under layers of broken ferrocrete, twisted metal, and corpses. Weight pressed down on him, armor screaming as it braced. His hammer was driven from his grasp, lost in the shifting mass. For a long moment, there was nothing but pressure, the scream of stressed servos, and the quiet, unpleasant creak of bones that would have snapped in any lesser being. He could have let go. He did not. He pushed. Jacks in his armor flared as he forced his limbs to move against the crushing load. He gained a fraction of space around his helm, enough to draw in a breath of air thick with dust and the copper taste of blood. Somewhere nearby, someone was moaning, a raw animal sound from a throat half filled with rubble. "Lord, Primarch." The voice was faint, almost swallowed by the settling debris. Dorn turned his head, stones grinding. Against his helm. "Hold," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him down there, muffled and distant. Light seared his eyes as someone above finally clawed through. A gap opened in the debris, widening as armored hands tore chunks of ferrocrete away. A familiar, scarred face appeared in the opening, helm lenses flaring. "Lord Dorn!" a captain shouted. "Pull him free, now!" Hands reached down, gauntlets gripping his pauldron rims, his forearms. The men straining above were his sons, the remnants of whatever company had survived that sector's collapse. Their muscles stood out like steel cables. Armor servos whined as they hauled. Dorn emerged from the rubble like a corpse dragged from a grave. He blinked against the harsh light, blinking dust from his eyes. His armor was a ruin. Plates were cracked, some sheared away entirely to reveal dented inner layers. Fluid leaked from multiple breaches, gene-coded coolant and hydraulic medium mingling with the blood that had seeped in through torn seals. His hands bled where jagged stone had found their way into the joints of his gauntlets. He looked around.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The world had changed again. Where there had been ordered lines of trenches and walls, there were now jagged pits and islands of broken fortification. Fires burned in new places. Men screamed from holes they could not climb out of. The air was thicker with smoke and floating motes of pulverized stone. His surviving captains gathered around him, some limping, some missing limbs, all bearing the same carnage-worn look. "We are cut off," one said. "The corridors behind us are gone. The forward lines, some may still be holding, but we have no contact. The fortress is collapsing into itself." Dorn swayed for a heartbeat. Then he steadied. For the first time since Sebastus IV had begun, his sons heard something new in his voice. Not anger, that had always been there. Not grim resolve, that was his native state. This was something quieter, deeper. "Perhaps this is what we deserved," he said softly. The captain stared. In the constant thunder of war, the words seemed absurdly small, yet they carried a weight that pushed against their hearts. "We stood on terror," Dorn went on, more to himself than to them, though they heard every syllable. "We held, and yet we failed. We allowed the War Master to reach the palace. We allowed the Emperor to be broken upon his own throne. I brought you here to pay for that failure in blood. I thought we would break Perturabo and be cleansed. Instead, he has broken the ground under our feet." He looked each of them in the eye in turn. "We endure this," he said, "or we die here. There is no other end to this equation." No one argued. They were imperial fists. They had not come to Sebastus IV expecting to leave whole. "Rally what remains," Dorn said, straightening, dragging wrecked armor into something like readiness. "Find any pocket of our brothers you can reach. We will make our stand where we can, and when Perturabo comes again, we will show him that pain is something the 7th Legion knows how to return." He took a step forward, boots crunching on the shattered stone and bone that paved the new-made pit. Behind him, battered, bleeding, half-buried, the sons of the Emperor's Praetorian fell in around their father, ready to follow him deeper yet into the killing ground their uncle had built for them. Time lost all meaning. Once there had been a clock of sorts to the war on Sebastus IV. Opening bombardment, first waves, breach, counter-assault. There had been days and nights marked by the rise and fall of fire on the horizon, by the schedule of barrages and the tempo of advances. After a while, even that vanished. For 3 solar weeks and 6 days, the battle rotted down into fragments. Company banners that had once fluttered above ranked formations were torn away, shredded, burned, trampled. The 7th Legion ceased to exist as a single, coherent blade. It became shards scattered throughout the eternal fortress, squads fighting in isolation in trenches that had no names, in bunkers whose designations had burned away with the paint on their walls. There was no front line. There was only proximity to the enemy. A squad of Imperial fists might hold a cramped communications tunnel for an entire day, repelling 3 Iron Warrior assaults, only to emerge and find that the corridors to left and right had collapsed or been overrun hours ago. A lone sergeant might lead the few survivors of his unit through a maze of half-flooded galleries, following the echo of bolter fire in the distance in the hope of finding other Sons of Dawn, only to encounter a kill team of Iron Warriors doing the same. Fights broke out in storerooms, in ammunition vaults, in ventilation shafts, where there was not even room to swing a weapon properly, only to stab and choke in the dark. Who held what at any given moment was unknowable. Trenches and strongpoints changed hands so often that their previous owners' corpses lay layered underfoot like sediment, grey over yellow over grey again, each stratum a few hours older than the last. In that grinding labyrinthine attrition, ammunition dwindled. Bolter magazines that had once been fed by steady supply lines ran dry. Lascannon's cells drained and could not be replaced. Missile stocks burned out. The fortress was a hungry thing, and its appetite for shells and power cells was infinite. The 7th Legion could not match it. Imperial fists fought on regardless. A brother emptied the last rounds from his bolt gun into an Iron Warrior charging him down a corridor, saw the traitor stagger, but not fall, and did not pause to curse. He swung the weapon like a club instead, the heavy casing crunching into the side of the Iron Warrior's helm with a wet, ringing crack. The blow dented ceramite and underlying skull, driving the helm's inner workings into the flesh beneath. The Iron Warrior reeled, one eye lens shattering, an arc of blood spraying from under the rim. The fist hit him again and again, until the helm split enough for him to jam his combat blade through the gap and out the other side, the point emerging in a gout of brain and broken glass. He wrenched the knife free, letting the body drop, and turned to meet the next enemy with his bolter held ready in both hands, grip reversed for maximum leverage. Knives became primary weapons. Bayonets, once an afterthought on the muzzles of rifles, were prized. Imperial fists, bred and trained for precision fire and disciplined advance, discovered they were very good at smashing skulls into ferrocrete walls. They grabbed Iron Warriors by the gorget, slammed their heads backward against bulkheads until helmets split and teeth flew, then drove their blades into the meat revealed beneath. They fought on their knees when their legs were torn away, on their backs when they were knocked down, stabbing upward into groins and underarms and any exposed joint they could reach. Every surface in the fortress's contested zones bore the marks of that intimacy. Walls were smeared with handprints in blood, long streaks where fingers had clawed for purchase as their owners were dragged away. Corners were splashed with arterial sprays. The floors of narrow passageways were layered in fragments of bone and teeth, crushed underfoot until they became part of the dust. There were no safe places. Medici stations, such as they were, had been dug into what had once been secondary command posts, storage rooms, even collapsed ingress points. They were charnel houses. Apothecaries in white and yellow moved through aisles of cots and pallets where every Astartes lay wounded. There were no minor injuries anymore. Every warrior admitted to those spaces had lost something significant: an arm, a leg, an eye, a lung. Some were limbless trunks, their stumps sealed by hasty cauterization, their black carapaces cracked. Some had had half their skulls replaced by hurried augmetics that whined softly as they tried and failed to sink to damaged brains. There was no talk of rest. Those who could still grip a weapon were swiftly re-equipped and sent back. A Marine who had lost both legs and one arm woke to find himself bolted into a crude walking sarcophagus, a mockery of a dreadnought built from scavenged armor plates and servo rigs. His remaining hand was locked around the grip of a heavy bolter that had been integrated into the frame. A tech Marine patted the improvised harness almost affectionately. "You can still kill," the red-armored figure said. "That is enough." The limbless Marine said nothing. His eyes, the only parts of his face still flesh, burned with a dull, steady light. Other wounded were strapped into jury-rigged weapon mounts, their bodies used as stabilizers for guns that would otherwise have lacked a proper field carriage. And Astartes, with his lower body gone, was lashed to the rear of a Lascanon frame, his enhanced mass anchoring the weapon under recoil. The barrel spat white beams down a corridor, and each time it fired, the shock shuddered through his torn spine, sending knives of pain through his abdomen. He grunted with each shot and continued to hold the grip. There were no rear lines. There were only different depths of the same nightmare. On the Iron Warrior's side, the strain told as well. Stockpiles that had seemed inexhaustible when the Eternal Fortress had been designed now ran low. Shell dumps were emptied. Some guns fell silent, their crews reduced to watching through binoculars as Imperial fists advanced past their positions, close enough to see their plate scars and kill marks. Those crews picked up small arms and joined the line or waited for the inevitable when the yellow-armored giants reached them. Defensive sectors that had once boasted full-strength squads now held half that number at best. Iron Warriors, who had prided themselves on perfect fire discipline, found their shots going wild as fatigue finally breached their mental armor. They had held sieges before. They had starved out populations, ground down fleets, watched bastions crumble over weeks and months. They were used to being the immovable object. The 7th Legion's refusal to die made a mockery of their odds. In one command den, a warsmith slammed his fist into the wall, leaving a dent in the armored plating. "This is waste," he snarled. "By any calculation, they should have broken days ago. We have given them every reason. Encirclement, casualty ratios vastly against them. No resupply. They should be falling back, if not routing entirely, and yet they keep coming." His subordinate, helm tucked under one arm, wiped blood from his face, where a near miss in the line had found a chink in his armor. "They do not calculate in that way, Lord," the Iron Warrior said. "They are not thinking in terms of optimum loss for gain. They are thinking in terms of penance." The warsmith bared his teeth. "Penance is not a valid variable," he snapped. "It does not factor." "It does now," his subordinate replied quietly. Even so, the Eternal Fortress continued to function as it had been designed to. Every time an Imperial Fist squad or ad hoc battle group fought its way into a position that looked like a genuine breakthrough, something buried and hateful woke. In one sector, a corridor finally taken at horrific cost, its entrance choked with the remains of 3 squads of Iron Warriors and twice that many Imperial Fists, suddenly vomited fire from hidden murder holes. Wall panels that had looked like patches of damage blew away to reveal arrays of flamer nozzles. Tongues of burning promethium roared out, filling the space from floor to ceiling. Men burned where they stood, their ceramite blackening, lenses blistering, the flesh beneath cooking. Those behind tried to fall back, trampling burning brothers, only to trigger a series of melter charges planted under the corridor floor. The entire section collapsed into a molten pit, consuming attackers and defenders alike. In another area, what had seemed to be an empty gallery turned out to be the roof of a concealed firing chamber. As Imperial fists stormed across it, the supports were blown. The floor gave way, spilling them down into a chamber where Iron Warriors' heavy weapon teams had long since calibrated their arcs. The falling loyalists were cut to pieces by intersecting streams of autocannon fire and heavy bolter rounds before they even hit the ground. Each victory became a new kill zone. Each hard-won advance was revealed to be just another step deeper into a geometry of suffering. Dorn moved through this ruin like a spectre. His warplate, once bright, was now a dark, ugly thing. Soot and congealed blood coated it in uneven layers, so that the original gold and yellow showed only in scratches and chips where fresh damage had cut through the filth. His helm lenses burned with a steady, grim light. There was no part of the fortress where his sons did not at least think he might appear. He would be seen in a trench that was seconds from failing, dragging wounded brothers out of collapsing revetments, his hands as steady under falling debris as they had been on the walls of terror. Minutes later, he would be reported in a bunker 3 sectors away, decapitating an Iron Warrior champion with a single clean stroke of his blade, the traitor's head tumbling end over end into a crowd of his own men. He did not sleep. He did not rest. It was as if he had become an avenging spirit bound to the geometry of the fortress itself, appearing wherever the structure threatened to buckle and shoring it up with his own presence. For his sons, seeing him was both a boon and a curse. "It means we stand here," a sergeant muttered to his squad as Dorn strode past, his hammer slick with enemy blood. "Or that this is where we die." In half-ruined bunkers, in chambers where walls had been blown away to expose the raw rock beyond, Dorn's captains still tried to fight a war of planning. They spread what maps they still had across cracked tables. They marked routes in charcoal, adjusted their plans every time another corridor collapsed or was discovered to be blocked by new fortification. They did what they had always done, sought patterns, designed assaults, tried to impose order on chaos. Eventually, always, the conversation came back to the same point. "We must withdraw," one captain said, the words ground out as if they physically pained him. "We must break out of the inner works, fall back to a defensible perimeter and regroup. Call for reinforcements. We have bled enough here." Dorn stood at the edge of the table, hands planted on its rim. Cracks radiated outward from his fingers in the stone. "To withdraw is to admit that Perturabo has defeated us," he said. "To admit that his walls are stronger than our will. Is that what you want written in the annals of the Seventh?" "I want the Seventh to exist," the captain replied, "to continue to fight in the Emperor's name beyond this world. If we are shattered here, what then? Who holds the next wall that needs holding?" Others added their voices. They spoke of attrition numbers that could not be denied, of the loss of their armor, of the decimation of their veteran cadres. They spoke of terror too, but less as a wound to be avenged, and more as a warning of how close even the mightiest could come to being destroyed entirely. Dorn listened. He let them speak until their arguments ran out, until the words came out hoarse and exhausted. Then he shook his head. "Only this can purge what we failed to do at Terra," he said. His voice was flat, not the thunderous bellow he used on the line, but something colder. "We let the walls fall. We let the War Master reach the throne. We live because the Emperor chose to die in our place. There is no ledger that balances that, no codex, no strategy council. There is only pain. We endure it here, or we leave this wound to fester in our souls forever." "We will be destroyed," another captain said. "We cannot hold like this for much longer." "Then we die," Dorn replied. "Better that than carry this failing untested. If we survive Sebastus, we will be remade. If not, then our end will at least be honest." There was no rhetoric in it, no attempt to inspire. It was simply his conclusion, the only line that made sense to him. In the Iron Warriors' deeper command dens, similar councils formed, but their tone was different. Warsmiths knelt over their own maps, theirs etched into metal and stone, marked with sigils representing artillery arrays, minefields, the locations of remaining reserves. Their gauntleted fingers ran along the paths the Imperial fists had taken, tracing the knots where the Seventh's remnants had dug in hardest. "We can end this," one said, looking up to where Perturabo stood at the edge of the chamber. "We have enough reserves left. If we gather them into a single force and strike here and here, we can crush these remaining concentrations of the Seventh while they are cut off. We close the cage, and what is left of their legion dies in it." Others murmured agreement. The prospect was alluring. Annihilating a loyalist legion outright would be a victory that echoed through the ages. It would be a clean conclusion to this bitter, grinding work. Perturabo was unmoved. He flicked his gaze over the projections, then back to the casualty estimates, scrolling along the margins. He saw, with an engineer's mind, the pattern of Dorn's ruin. It had a shape now, not the total destruction the warsmiths craved, but a crooked, painful curve of attrition and obstinacy. We are close to the point where, continued defense becomes inefficient, he said. Our own reserves are not infinite. Our ammunition will not last forever. Our guns are beginning to fall silent one by one. If we commit everything to one blow and fail, we risk being left with nothing when the counterstroke comes. The counterstroke? A warsmith asked. From whom? The Ultramarines are busy making laws. The other loyalist legions are scattered. The 7th is here. If we kill them, we remove one of the few forces still fully loyal to the throne. Perturabo's jaw tightened. I am not interested in a tally of dead legions, he said. I am interested in the proof that my fortress, my design, my equation was superior to Dorn's pride. I am interested in the exact point at which his honor broke. I want that curve. That is the knife I am twisting. Total annihilation would be imprecise. He turned away from the maps, eyes distant. Let him fight on, Perturabo went on. Let his legion dwindle to a hardened core that refuses to die. Let them throw themselves against wall after wall until there is almost nothing left. Let their geniseed be spent in ditches and tunnels and corridors. Then, when they are on the brink, when they are more ghost than army, then we decide if we kill them or let them live with what they have become. The warsmiths exchanged glances. Some understood, some did not. None dared argue further. Above all this, Sebastus IV bore the scars. Billions were dead. Entire continents had been repurposed as slave barracks and artillery parks. Those slave continents were now little more than smoking plains of cratered mud and broken machinery. Their populations fed into the guns until nothing remained but heaps of bones and abandoned chains. Regions that had once been hive complexes or manufactoria were now indistinguishable from the fortress's outer works, the distinction between city and redoubt long since erased by shellfire. From orbit, where a few still functioning picked systems on loyalist ships continued to record, vast swathes of the planet appeared as blackened scars. Lines of trench and bastion cut across them in stark patterns, like diseased veins. Here and there, patches of molten glass glimmered where lance strikes had burned away everything down to bedrock. Every mortal auxiliar regiment that had come with the 7th Legion to this world had been annihilated or broken. Some had been wiped out in the first days, their banners swallowed by the opening bombardments and the initial storming assaults. Others had been ground down over weeks, their numbers dwindling from tens of thousands to a few hundred ragged survivors who clung to their Astartes allies like children sheltering behind a parent's legs. Those who lived long enough to understand what they were walking through sometimes went mad. A guardsman might look down at the mud, sucking at his boots, and realize that the dark clumps in it were not rocks, but fingers and teeth. He might recognize the regimental patch on a half-buried shoulder plate as his own. He might see, in a flash of rational horror, that the entire world had become a grave made of its defenders. As the final week began, both legions were near their own breaking points. The Iron Warriors had emptied magazines and shell racks that they had once believed would last siege after siege. Guns that had not needed maintenance since the fortress was built now sat silent, their barrels eroded, their breech mechanisms warped by overuse. Defensive posts were manned by squads that would once have been deemed unfit for the line, wounded, shell-shocked, men who had not slept in longer than they could remember. Their patience, a quality they had always prided themselves on, wore thin. Jokes became bitter, grumbling about Perturabo's obsession with this one enemy and this one fortress, while the galaxy burned. grew louder. The Imperial fists had been reduced to a core that was more scar tissue than flesh. Whole companies existed now, as a list of names carved into the inside of a chaplain's helm. The remaining companies were under-strength shadows of what they had been, each Marine bearing enough wounds to cripple a lesser warrior, each man carrying the memories of squads snuffed out in moments. They spoke less. Orders were given, acknowledged, obeyed. There were no boasts, no prayers beyond the most functional litanies of weapon maintenance and aim. Even their war cries had faded. They fought in near feral silence, teeth gritted, eyes burning behind cracked lenses. In one battered trench section, an iron warrior peered over the parapet at the figures advancing toward his position. They moved in loose formation, not the crisp lines of earlier assaults. Their armor was a patchwork of yellow and bare metal, scraped down to ceramite in places. Many were missing shoulder trims, knee pads, entire sections of plate. They looked more like revenants than Astartes. "They keep coming," he muttered to the brother beside him. "How many did we kill in that last barrage?" "Enough," the other replied. "Not enough," the first said. He watched as a fist took a Lascanon beam full in the chest, staggered, and kept walking, his armor smoking. A hole burned through his aquila. He watched another take a bolter shell to the helm, the round detonating and showering fragments, and still the Astartes kept moving, blinking blood out of his remaining lens. "They are ghosts," the Iron Warrior said. "We are fighting ghosts." The Eternal Fortress held. The 7th Legion still advanced. The iron cage that had been built for Dorn was almost full. The message that saved the 7th Legion was not a cry for help. It was a wound in the warp. The crippled ships that had torn themselves from Sebastus's gravity well crawled through the immaterium like gut-shot beasts. Hulls split, keels bent, Geller fields ragged and shrieking. They left behind them a trail of psychic debris, echoing pain and defiance. Astropaths along their shattered spines howled their last as they burned out, their souls flaring against the darkness. Far away, in the ordered stars of Ultramar, those echoes found purchase. In the astropathic choir of Macraga's high command, hooded figures convulsed. Veins stood out on their throats as alien pain punched through them. They saw, through eyes that were no longer theirs, yellow-armored giants fighting knee-deep in gore, bastions rising like broken teeth, an 8-pointed star carved into the flesh of a world. They tasted iron and dust, and the bitter tang of Rogel Dorn's stubborn despair. Robut Guilliman listened. He stood behind the choir rail, his blue armor casting their chamber in cold reflection. The Lord of Ultramar closed his eyes as the master of the choir forced the words through a throat slick with blood. 7th, trapped. Sebastus, fortress, iron, cage. The words cracked apart at the edges, overloaded by distance and the storm that was the post-heresy warp. The meaning was clear enough. When the last astropath fell silent, smoke curling from the empty pits of his eyes, Guilliman spoke a single order. "Alert the 13th, he said. The Ultramarines mobilized like the machine of war Guilliman had always intended them to be. Orders rippled out from Macraga like shockwaves. Reserve fleets changed course mid-transit. Muster codes sounded in fortress monasteries, in battle barges, in scattered bastions across Ultramar's protectorate worlds. Armories opened. Armor was blessed and sealed. Bolters were loaded. Stormbirds and Thunderhawks were roused from their cradles. This was not the Great Crusade. There would be no triumphant compliance ceremonies, no remembrances painting glorious vistas. Guilliman read the casualty estimates from Sebastus with cold eyes and understood that what awaited there was not victory, but accounting. When the 13th Legion translated into the Sebastus system, they came as a fresh blade into a butcher's shop. The warp tore and spat them into real space, amidst a graveyard of shattered ships and drifting wreckage. The debris field around Sebastus was thicker now, the remnants of the earlier engagements between the 7th and the Iron Warriors. Broken hulls spun, their torn metal ribs glinting in the light of the system's star. Here and there, faint Vox beacons still flickered, attached to life pods or crippled escorts. Guilliman stood on the strategium of his flagship and took in the scene in a heartbeat. "Status of friendly vessels?" he asked. "Scattered, Lord," an officer answered. "We are picking up Imperial Fists transponders on a handful of ships at the system periphery. All heavily damaged. No major capital assets remain in stable orbit. Surface Vox is a void. We are receiving nothing from the world itself." "And the enemy?" Perturabo, in his armored tower, received the same information. "The 13th, a warsmith reported. Ultramarines, an intact legion by all scans that have penetrated the debris." Perturabo's mouth thinned. He had expected interference, eventually. Guilliman could never resist involving himself in the affairs of others, but the timing galled him. The cage was almost full. The curve of Dorn's suffering had reached a pleasing asymmetry. To have it interrupted now, when he was so close to his conclusion. "What are our options?" he asked, though he already knew. The warsmith did not flinch from the arithmetic. "Lord, we can commit to finishing the 7th, he said. "If we throw our reserves into the fortress now, we might crush what remains of them before the Ultramarines can land in force, but their fleet will then have free reign in orbit. They will strip our ships from the sky and pound Sebastus from above. The fortress will not survive that." "Or?" Perturabo prompted. "Or we turn to meet the 13th in space," the warsmith went on. "We may inflict serious damage. You have bested Guilliman before, but with our ammunition reserves already depleted, our hulls scarred, the odds of fighting off an intact legion, while also maintaining pressure on the 7th, are poor." He did not give a number. Perturabo had already calculated it. He could annihilate the 7th or fight 2 legions, not both. The equation did not please him. "Guilliman," he muttered, the name a curse. "He comes to steal my proof." In orbit, the Ultramarines struck. Guilliman did not waste time on speeches to the enemy. His orders were crisp, his doctrine clear. Squadrons of strike cruisers peeled off from the main fleet, lances and macro batteries spitting in coordinated patterns. They did not seek glorious duels. They targeted engine clusters, weapon mounts, weak points identified from long experience and sharper analysis. Iron Warrior ships, battered already by their earlier struggle with the 7th, found themselves under new, ruthless fire. One cruiser, its void shields already unreliable, took a spread of lance strikes across its flank. Its armor boiled away. Atmosphere vented in bright, explosive geysers. Secondary explosions walked along its length, turning broadside gun decks into rows of shattered teeth. It began to tumble, nose over stern, trailing debris. Boarding actions flared where Ultramarines' assault craft slammed into enemy hulls. But Guilliman's primary goal was not to seize these ships. It was to push them out of position, to open holes in the cordon above Sebastus. "Force them to maneuver," he ordered. "We are not here to win honor duels. We are here to create corridors." It worked. Iron Warrior captains pulled their vessels away from optimum bombardment orbits, seeking to avoid the worst of the 13th's fire. In doing so, they opened gaps in the lethal shell that had hung over Sebastus for so long. Through those gaps, Ultramarines' drop fleets plunged. Thunderhawks and Stormbirds, escorted by sleek Xiphon fighters, and Thunderbolt squadrons knifed into the atmosphere. Their descent vectors were calculated to bring them down near the most embattled Imperial Fist positions, as near as the failing Auspex would allow. Guilliman had no time to be delicate. His sons would land in fire and adjust on the ground. On Sebastus, under a sky that had forgotten how to be anything but red, exhausted Imperial Fists looked up as something new screamed down through the murk. The first they knew of it was the sound, not the banshee howl of incoming shells, Not the crack of Lascanon beams, but the rising, turbine roar of engines pushed to their limits. Then they saw them. Shapes knifing down through the smoke, contrails flaring. Dropships, blue and white, bearing the sigils of Ultramar. They crashed into Iron Warrior-held ridges and trench lines like meteorites. Ramps slammed down into a hurricane of fire. Ultramarines poured out, forming firing lines even as they ran. Their armor was bright, clean, its blue unmarred by the soot and gore that coated their fist cousins. Their formations were textbook perfect, their fields of fire overlapping with the ease of drilled instinct. They hit Iron Warrior flanks that had grown used to a dull, attritional grind and tore into them with disciplined aggression. In one torn and blackened trench, a handful of Imperial fists huddled behind the charred stump of a bunker, bolters empty, blades notched, as Iron Warriors advanced across the open ground toward them. They had been counting heartbeats to the end. Then bolt fire ripped into the Iron Warriors from their right. The traitors staggered, armor sparking under the sudden hail. Some fell, headless, chest plates blown open. Others turned, raising their weapons, just in time to see a line of blue-armored giants crest the lip of a shattered embankment and descend upon them with calm, murderous precision. The Ultramarines moved like a living firing drill. First rank fired, then stepped aside to clear their lanes. Second rank stepped forward, adding their shots. When they closed, they did so as a unified front, blades and pistols working in perfect support of one another. An Imperial fist watched as an Iron Warrior lunged at him, only to be taken in the side by an Ultramarine's gladius, the blade sliding in at exactly the right angle to slip under a pauldron and through a ribcage. The fist's knife, which had been coming up to meet the blow, found only air. For a heartbeat, the yellow-armored warrior stared at the newcomer. The Ultramarine nodded once. "Hold the line," he said. "You have done enough here." The Imperial fist snorted. "Being saved by the Codex," he muttered, almost to himself. "That stings worse than any wound." His squad heard and laughed, the sound ragged but real. Then they rose and moved to fight alongside the 13th, their resentment folding itself into renewed violence. Dorn, deep in the fortress guts, tried to pretend nothing had changed. Reports filtered in over battered Vox circuits, distorted and intermittent. Sightings of blue armor, Vox phrases in crisp Ultramar battle cant, ident codes from 13th Legion units. He heard them. He knew what they meant. "Ultramarines have made planetfall," a captain told him in a half-collapsed bunker. "They are relieving several of our most pressed positions. Their fleet is engaging the Iron Warriors in orbit. If we coordinate with them, we might be able to break out of the inner works and establish—" "We press on," Dorn said. The captain blinked. "Lord, with respect." "With respect," Dorn cut him off. "We came here to break Perturabo in his own house. We did not come here to be rescued by Robut and his book. The 7th will finish what it began." "The 7th will be destroyed," the captain said. There was steel in his voice. He had stood on terror. He had earned the right to speak. "If we keep driving deeper into this fortress while the 13th bleed for our extraction, we will lose everything we were meant to protect. The Emperor does not need dead heroes. He needs legions that can still fight." Dorn's eyes narrowed. "You would have us run," he said. "I would have us live," the captain replied. "Enough of our brothers have died in the Emperor's name. Enough have died for your honor. This does not have to end with the 7th entombed on Sebastus." Silence fell in the bunker. Dust drifted in lazy spirals from the cracked ceiling. In the doorway, the light from a distant fire flickered. When Dorn spoke, his voice was low. "You presume much," he said. "I presume to speak what others think," the captain said. His hands were steady on his bolter. He did not flinch from his Primarch's gaze. "If you order us to keep pushing, we will. We will die to a man, but it will not be for the Imperium. it will be because you would rather see the 7th extinguished than accept that you cannot atone for terror with this one perfect wound. Outside, Sebastus shook under a new pattern of bombardments. Perturabo, furious that Guilliman had inserted himself into this war, gave fresh orders. "Shift the fortress heavy guns," he commanded. "Priority targets are ultramarine vectors. I will not have Robute strutting through my equations unopposed." "Lord the 7th," a warsmith began. "Will die if they remain," Perturabo snapped, "whether by my hand or another's. The 13th, however, think they can tie a neat bow around this and write a chapter about their rescue of the noble imperial fists. I will not have it." The fortress's surviving macro batteries groaned as they elevated, slewing away from the familiar arcs that had pulverized the 7th for weeks. Their muzzles tracked upward, finding the blue-armored dropships knifing through the clouds. They fired in long, ripping blasts, shells bursting among the descending craft. Stormbirds blew apart, their wings shearing off under the impacts. Thunderhawks took hits that cracked their spines, sending them pinwheeling into the ground. Ultramarines died in their turn, their bodies reduced to shrapnel and flame. Guilliman, watching the returns on his stratagem, saw the shift. "He is offended," he observed. "Good. Keep the pressure on. We must open a path for Dorn whether he wants it or not." He demanded a Vox channel. It took time to force through the interference, time measured in lives lost in the corridors and trenches below. When the link finally stabilized, it was a thin thread between two storms, crackling, distorted, but enough. "Rogel," Guilliman said. Dorn stiffened when he heard his brother's voice. "Robut," he replied. "You have come to lecture me in person." "I have come to keep you from throwing away your legion," Guilliman said. "You are trapped in a fortress designed to kill you, built by a Primarch who knows you better than you know yourself. Your fleet is broken. Your regiments are gone. Your legion bleeds out in ditches and tunnels. You cannot win this war alone." "We are not alone," Dorn said. "We have the Emperor." "The Emperor is a corpse on a throne," Guilliman snapped. "He will not reach down through the warp and pluck you from Sebastus. The only aid you are going to receive is already here, in the form of the 13th. Use it." "You would have the 7th hide behind the 13th, Dorn said. "You would have us abandon this task half done, slink away while another finishes what we began." "I would have you survive," Guilliman replied. "Do you remember terror? Do you remember what it took to hold those walls? We did not do it so that you could waste the 7th on one man's pride. You talk of penance. Fine. You have paid it. In blood, in gene seed, in the lives of every mortal who stood with you. This is not a pain glove you can leave your legion in until it comes out improved. It is a grinder. It will reduce you to nothing. Only this can purge our failure," Dorn said. His voice was iron. "We let Horus reach the throne. We live because the Emperor does not. There is no measure sufficient to balance that loss. Only this cage. Then let the cage close around something other than your neck," Guilliman said. "Withdraw. Allow my sons to cover you. Accept that sometimes strategic reality matters more than symbolic gestures." Static washed across the connection. Dorn's reply came through in fragments. "The 7th, not broken for your codex. We endure." Guilliman's jaw clenched. "Then I will order it," he said, "whether you accept it or not. The 7th Legion will not die here, not while I still have ships and men to prevent it." He cut the channel. Orders went out across ultramarine voxnets. New descent vectors were plotted, not toward the fortress's heart, but toward the locations where the 7th's remnants still held. Assault companies were reassigned. Extraction points were designated, whether Rogel Dorn approved of them or not. On the ground, blue and yellow fought side by side to carve a way out of the cage. In one corridor, its walls slick with centuries of sweat and the fresh blood of this war, Ultramarines breached a bulkhead with melter charges and stormed into a chamber where Imperial fists were down to knives and fists against a pressing wall of iron warriors. The 13th took the traitors in the back, blades sliding between plates with surgical precision. "Fall back, fists," an ultramarine captain ordered. "Second line, we will hold this junction. Your wounded are being evacuated to the rear." "The 7th does not fall back," a fist sergeant growled, even as he sagged with exhaustion. "The 7th does today," the ultramarine said. "Your Primarch will kill you if I do not get you off this world. Consider this my apology." They fought together, bolters barking, chainswords snarling. Step by step, they forced the Iron Warriors back enough to begin a fighting withdrawal. It was not elegant. Every meter cost lives. Stretchers bearing limbless Astartes and whimpering mortal soldiers passed under the cover of the 2 legions' guns. Dreadnoughts, their sarcophagi scarred by countless blows, backed through doorways to hold them with their bulk. Perturabo saw the pattern and shifted his aim. If he could not annihilate the 7th in glorious isolation, he would at least deny them an orderly exit. "Collapse the tunnels behind them," he ordered. "Target choke points. Breach the medici stations. Hunt for their wounded. Let them drag only corpses to the evacuation points." Charges blew in galleries that had seemed secure, ceilings falling in just as mortally wounded Marines were being carried through. Rescue teams were crushed or buried alongside those they had come to save. Makeshift medici bays that had been established in what passed for the rear were suddenly assaulted by Iron Warrior breachers, chainswords carving through cots and bodies alike, blood spraying across walls already stained brown with old stains. Some pockets of Imperial fists never received the order to withdraw. Their Vox units failed, or the corridors between them and the extraction routes collapsed first. They fought on in ignorance, believing they were still part of an ongoing assault, rather than men abandoned in a fortress that was already being evacuated around them. Those few survivors who were later recovered from Sebasta's gutted husk would speak of fighting in silence for hours, days, perhaps longer, until the guns finally fell quiet and they realized they were alone. In the final hours, Dorn stood at an extraction point cut into the side of a shattered bastion. Thunderhawks and Stormbirds hovered beyond, their engines whipping up storms of dust and ash. Ramps slammed down, disgorging ultramarine squads who formed secure perimeters, while Imperial fists limped aboard. The air was thick with exhaust and the smell of hot metal. Dorn looked back. The Eternal Fortress sprawled behind him, a vast maze of ruins. Bastions that had once stood tall were broken stumps. Trenches had collapsed into ravines and pits. The 8-pointed geometry had been warped by bombardment and collapse, but was still visible, carved into the world's bones. Oceans of dead lay in its hollows, their bodies already settling into new strata of bone and armor. He saw the broken remnants of his legion moving through that landscape. Squads reduced to a handful of men, companies that no longer had enough bodies to carry their standards, apothecaries with gene seed cases half empty, the organs they had managed to recover rattling inside like the teeth of some slain beast. Whether Perturabo had won or not did not matter. The 7th Legion that walked off Sebastus IV was not the one that had arrived. It was smaller, harder, more scarred in body and spirit. Something had been burned out of it in the cage, and something else forged in that emptiness. Dorn saw that, and for the first time he wondered truly if he had been willing to sacrifice too much to that forge. He turned away and boarded the Thunderhawk. Far beneath, in a chamber that had never seen the light of day, Perturabo made ready to leave. Around him lay the trophies of the Iron Cage, halved helms bearing the fist of the 7th, broken thunder hammers and shields, armor plates stripped from the dead, their battle honors scored through with jagged lines, gene seed capsules taken from fallen Imperial fists, their contents glimmering in the cold light like obscene jewels. Bones, too, carefully selected, etched with sigils that were not of the Imperial lexicon. He had his legion's own relics as well, standards torn from bastions that had fallen, cogitator cores filled with casualty data, servo skulls that had recorded every moment of the siege, their memory stacks heavy with horror. He arranged them on an altar of jagged iron and black stone. The words he spoke were not those of the imperial cult. They were older and newer. They were the language of the powers that had watched him build the fortress, that had whispered in the back of his mind as he sketched its first lines on data slate and in blood. They had promised him recognition. They had promised him an apotheosis befitting a Primarch who had proved his mastery over despair. As the last drops of loyalist gene seed ran down the altar's sides and soaked into the porous stone, the air thickened. The world shuddered once more, but this time it was not from an impact or a deliberate detonation. It was from something leaving. The Iron Warriors withdrew into the warp, their ships limping but not broken, gathering up what remained of their strength and vanishing into the howling dark. Behind them, Sebastus burned. The eternal fortress, that monumental expression of hatred and geometry, collapsed in on itself as abandoned structural wards failed and delayed charges finally detonated. The eight-pointed star blurred, edges crumbling, lines turning to slag and dust. When the last Thunderhawk bearing yellow armor cleared the atmosphere, there was nothing left below them but a blackened scar on a dying world and the echo of a cage that had closed and then emptied. Iron had bent, steel had held. Neither had escaped without breaking. Sebastus 4 died badly. From orbit, when the last survey drones of the 13th Legion swept their auger eyes across its face, the world looked like a corpse left too long in the sun. The skin of its continents was split and blackened, a patchwork of glass scars and crater fields. Lines of fortification and trench, once so precise, had sagged under bombardment and collapse until the eight-pointed star was visible only as a twisted ghost, burned into the crust. Closer views were worse. Picked archives recorded miles upon miles of trenches filled to their lips with bodies. Yellow and grey armor lay heaped together, the colors muted by ash. Limbs protruded from mud that would never dry, fingers twisted, hands locked forever around weapons or throats. Skulls grinned from walls, where blast waves had stripped the flesh from men, but left their bones wedged into revetments. In some places, the dead lay so thick that the trenches were simply bridges of bone and ceramite, resting atop a foundation of compacted meat. Even Astartes had become meat here. Gene-forged demigods, built to stride across battlefields as near-immortal engines of war, lay in pieces like any other carcass, their transhuman features unrecognizable beneath the ruin. Armor that had carried the heraldry of the Seventh and the Iron Warriors for centuries was reduced to scrap, their honors meaningless in the face of a mortar shell that did not care whose plate it tore open. Landers traced grinding paths through this ossuary, the few Mechanicum crews assigned to salvage and record moving with a speed born of revulsion. They documented enough to satisfy the Administratum's need for archives, then left the rest to the crows of whatever feral, rad-twisted life might one day crawl across Sebastus's surface. It was a tomb world now, though no inscription was ever carved into its sky. The living had no time for epitaphs. The survivors of the 7th Legion were gathered, as far as they could be gathered, aboard the hospital ships and refitted troop carriers that formed the temporary sanctuary of what remained of Dorn's sons. There were not many. Less than half their former strength, the logisticians said, though they did not give the exact fractions allowed. Many of those counted as survivors would never fight again. They lay in rows on cots and in stasis tanks, the steady hiss of life support and the occasional brittle laugh of a shell-shocked mortal nurse, the only sounds in those vast, white-lit holds. Every refugee from the Eternal Fortress carried scars. Some were obvious, limbless torsos, fitted with crude augmetic stumps, that would one day be replaced with more elegant machinery. faces that were more metal than flesh, vox grills where jaws had once been, new lenses shining cold in empty sockets, chests bound in layers of synth skin and ceramite, where ribs had been regrown around damaged black carapaces. Men who had been beautiful in the terrible way of the Astartes now resembled the broken statues of their own monuments. Other wounds were quieter. Astartes stared at bulkheads for hours, seeing not plasteel, but ferrocrete walls collapsing over them, hearing in the groan of the ship's hull the distant echo of artillery shells smashing into parapets. Mortal orderlies learned not to touch some warriors without speaking first. A hand laid on an arm to adjust a drip line could result in that arm clamping around their wrist with bone-breaking force before the Marine realized he was no longer in a trench on Sebastus. None of them were ready to return to war. For decades, entire companies would be kept from frontline deployment, their bodies undergoing repair, their minds undergoing something more nebulous. The 7th Legion had been gutted, and what was left needed time that the Imperium did not truly have to give. In the midst of this, in a chamber deep within the phalanx, Rogel Dorn sought a different kind of repair. The pain glove awaited him. It stood in the center of a bare room, a cage of shimmering energy fields woven around a frame of adamantium and plasteel. It was a device of his legion's own making, born of their belief that pain was a teacher when embraced, not merely endured. Warriors used it to test themselves, to learn the limits of their endurance, to scour weakness from their souls. Dorn stepped into it and sealed it from within. He reached for the control rune. His hand hovered over the setting that would be considered severe for any of his sons. He passed it. His fingers tapped in new sequences, dialing the fields far beyond their safe limits, into ranges that had been marked for mechanical testing only, never for flesh. The glove closed. Agony arrived like a tidal wave. Energy ripped through every nerve, every fiber. Muscles spasmed, bones creaked under sudden strain, implants flared as their protective systems registered intolerable stress. The world vanished in white, all senses overrun by the raw, screaming fact of pain. Good, Dorn thought, or tried to. Think, somewhere behind the hurricane. He forced his mind to hold images within that storm. Terror, the walls of the Imperial Palace shuddering under the impact of traitor guns. Blood on marble. The Emperor's broken body upon the golden throne. His own hands, stained with the oil-slick blood of his father, as he bore the master of mankind's body from the War Master's flagship. Failure, etched into the grooves of the palace like rot. Sebastus, trenches filling with his sons. The 8-pointed star carved into the world. Perturabo's laughter under falling stone. The moment when the ground dropped away, and his own arrogance nearly buried the 7th Legion alive. Each image sharpened the pain. Each recollection made the fields in the glove feel somehow appropriate, proportional. He stayed within them until his muscles tore and his implants cried out for shutdown, until blood ran from his nose and ears, until the sensors on the cage's frame shrieked emergency warnings and cut. The power lest their Primarch simply cook himself where he stood. He fell to his knees in the sudden absence of agony, the echo of it shuddering through him like aftershocks. He did not know how long he knelt there before the door opened. Robert Gilliman entered without ceremony, though he closed the hatch behind him and dismissed the attending tech marines with a glance. Dorn pushed himself to his feet. He did not offer greeting. His armor was off. He wore only a simple mantle over a plain tunic, stained darker where sweat had soaked through. His knuckles were raw, his eyes were bloodshot. Gilliman took in the pain glove, still humming faintly as its systems cooled, then looked at his brother. "You cannot scour this from yourself with pain," he said, "no matter how hard you try." Dorn said nothing. Gilliman stepped closer, his own armor a study in controlled symbolism, its blue and white unmarred, its laurel motif subtle but present. He carried a data slate, but when he spoke, he did not consult it. He had already committed its contents to memory. "Less than half," he said. "That is what remains of the 7th. Of those, a significant portion are unfit for combat for at least a decade by any sane standard. Your mortal formations are gone. The fortress on Sebastus is shattered, though the world itself remains poisoned. Perturabo has fled into the Eye, where he will be beyond our reach for a very long time. And somewhere in that hell, the gods he has chosen to serve have rewarded him for what he did there." He let the tally hang in the air. "A legion gutted," Gilliman continued. "A fortress obliterated. An enemy Primarch ascended to something worse. One can quibble about who won, who lost, whose honor was satisfied. The numbers do not lie." Dorn's jaw clenched. "And yet," Gilliman said, "the 7th still exists. It is not Horus's legion, broken and scattered beyond easy repair. It is not the 2nd or the 11th, names struck from our records. It is wounded, terribly, but alive. Its survivors are changed, hardened in ways that are not entirely healthy, but they are perhaps ready to hear what they would never have accepted before Sebastus." He held out the data slate. "The Codex," Dorn said. He did not take it. "More than that," Gilliman replied. "The 2nd founding, the division of the legions into chapters. Smaller, self-contained brotherhoods that can fight with the same fury, but cannot be turned as one against the Imperium. We both know what a single legion can do, for good and ill. You have proved it twice over now." Dorn's silence was a weight between them. "You could refuse," Gilliman said. "You could cling to the 7th as a single, monolithic entity, argue that your loyalty has been proven beyond question, and that you should not be punished for the failures of others. Many of your sons would cheer that. They would gladly follow you into another Sebastus, rather than see their legion broken." His eyes hardened. "But you have seen what happens when too much power, too much pride, is concentrated in one place, on Terra, on Sebastus. You have watched your own choices take the 7th to the brink of extinction twice in the span of a few short years. Ask yourself honestly whether any one legion, mine, yours, anyone's, should be able to do that again." Dorn took the data slate. His large hands dwarfed it. For a moment, he stared down at the scrolling fields of script that represented Gilliman's great work. Formations, chapter structures, chains of command, recommendations for deployment, a new architecture for the Astartes. He thought of the cage on Sebastus, of the way Perturabo had built his fortress not just as a weapon, but as a test, a structure designed to push the 7th to its absolute limits, to see what would break first. Walls could collapse, men could die, pride could be humbled. The only constant had been the relentless, grinding cost of it all. He bowed his head. "This is not capitulation," he said. "No," Gilliman agreed. "It is recognition. That no single legion should ever again be able to feed so many lives into a single test," Dorn said. "Not mine, not yours, not any of our brothers." He looked up. "The 7th will divide," he said quietly. "We will make chapters from our strength. Each will carry the gene of Dorn. Each will hold to our oaths. But never again will the Imperial fists be able to march as one, to bleed as one, as we did on Sebastus." "It will not erase what happened," Gilliman said. "It is not meant to," Dorn replied. Among the warriors who had survived the iron cage, certain men stood out. They were not necessarily the most decorated, nor the least scarred. Some had lost limbs, eyes, entire halves of their bodies. What set them apart was a look in their remaining eyes, a kind of hard, burning certainty that had been tempered, not extinguished, by the cage. They had gone into Perturabo's fortress, loyal to Dorn. They came out loyal to the idea of an unending war against the enemies of the Emperor, carried beyond any one world or fortress. When the time came to name new masters for the successor chapters, these men were marked. Some went with the Crimson Fists, who would guard the distant edges of the Imperium against threats that came from without, their red gauntlets a bloodied echo of their parent legion. Others formed the seeds of chapters that would stand sentinel over fortress worlds and bastions, their doctrines shaped by what they had learned in Perturabo's cage. And some were drawn to a different vision. Hard-eyed champions, too fanatical to ever truly know peace, gathered around a single, unshakable figure, the first High Marshal of the Black Templars. They had seen what it meant to be trapped within walls, what stubbornness and oath-bound fury could do when married to siegecraft. They turned that lesson outward. For them, the cage was not just a wound. It was a holy scar, a reminder that there could be no comprehension with heresy, no surrender, no armistice. Their crusades would burn across the stars, carrying with them the memory of Sebastus as a quiet, ever-present spur. When they broke Xenos strongholds or Chaos redoubts, when they burned worlds that had turned from the Emperor, some part of them would always be walking those trenches again, knee-deep in blood in a fortress that refused to end. In the Iron Warriors' strongholds, in the dark fastnesses within the warp, where time did not flow as it did in the realm of men, the story was told differently. There, the Iron Cage was a proud tale. They spoke of Perturabo's genius, how he had built a fortress that even the Emperor's Praetorian could not crack without shattering his own legion upon it. They said that Dorn had been broken there, his pride crushed under the weight of his own dead, his agreement to the breaking of his legion proof that Perturabo had left him alive out of spite, not mercy. Songs of iron and bitterness echoed through the eye. They praised the moment when their gene-sire had turned away from the wreckage of Sebastus and into the arms of the gods that had watched him build his cage. They raised toasts to his ascent as a demon prince, a being remade in iron and hate, and swore that his fortress would be remembered long after Dorn's walls had crumbled into dust. Imperial historians, for their part, were less unanimous. In the vaulted halls of Terra's archives, in scriptoriums lit by flickering lumen globes, men argued over faded records and half-burned cogitator cores. Some contended that Perturabo could have annihilated the Seventh at will, and chose not to, either out of some twisted, lingering affection for his brother, or because his true goal had never been simple extermination, but humiliation. Others pointed to the state of the Iron Warriors' own forces at the end of the siege, to ammunition ledgers and reports of half-manned walls, and argued that the traitors lacked the will or the resources to make the final sacrifices that total victory would have required. They claimed that Perturabo, for all his chosen god's whispers, had flinched from paying the last, highest cost. The truth lay buried under too many dead and too much propaganda. Veterans of the Iron Cage, those very few who survived long enough and sanely enough to speak of it later, tended to talk in different terms. When remembrancers or inquisitors pressed them for tales of triumph or defeat, they would fall silent for long stretches, eyes unfocused, the phantom scent of burned flesh and promethium thick in their memories. When they spoke, it was rarely of grand maneuvers or strategic outcomes. It was a place, one Astartes said at last, his voice rough, a place where two legions and two primarchs found out what they were willing to do to measure themselves against one another. That is all. Everything else, who won, who lost, is something you decide later, when you are not standing in the blood. Another, a mortal officer whose hair had gone white in a single campaign, put it more simply. There were walls, he said, and there were men on both sides of them who refused to go backward. That is all Sebastus was. The rest is decorations the priests hang on it so they can sleep at night. In the end, the Iron Cage became a lesson with more students than teachers. On Sebastus IV, the Imperium learned that loyalty was no guarantee against atrocity, that even those who stood unflinchingly for the Emperor could be led into wars where their stubborn pride would feed a meat grinder as hungrily as any traitor's spite. That fortification, that most sacred of arts to the Seventh and the Iron Warriors alike, could be turned into a theology of suffering if wedded to wounded honor. In the far future of the 41st millennium, when men in flak armor and ceramite plate speak of legendary wars, the cage is rarely mentioned among the common tales. It has no easy heroes, no simple villains, no clean banners planted over conquered ruins. But in the deeper histories, in the whispered traditions of successor chapters descended from the fists of Dorn, in the bitter songs of the Iron Warriors, Sebastus IV endures, not as a victory, not as a defeat, as a warning that in the wars to come, waged across a galaxy gone mad, such battles will not be remembered for who won, but for how many died to prove a point no sane universe ever asked them to make.